Hey guys, tonight we're heading deep into the grime, grit, and very questionable grooming habits of the Middle Ages. And look, I'll be real with you, you probably won't survive this. Not because it's terrifying, but because it's just so slowly, wonderfully boring, perfect for sleep. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Always fun to see who else is winding down around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, imagine waking up in the year 1243. Your straw mattress smells like, well, it's better not to describe it. You slept in the same wool tunic you wore yesterday, and the day before and the week before. No judgment, that's just how things go here. You sit up, scratch something you hope isn't lice, and the first thing you notice is how bad everything smells. But strangely, you don't mind, because everyone smells, like, bad. Not I forgot deodorant bad, more like I rolled in a fermented sheep bad. But here's the kicker. Despite what you've heard, people in the Middle Ages weren't completely disgusting. You've probably heard the old rumour that they didn't bathe for months or years. Not entirely true. In fact, many people, especially in cities, wanted to be clean. They had bathhouses, hot water, if they could afford firewood, and soaps made from animal fat and ash. The challenge? Staying clean was like drying off in a rainstorm. You would wash, sure, but your clothes were still dirty, your bed was full of bugs, and you lived next to people tossing their chamber pot contents out of the window every morning. So yeah, hygiene was more about trying your best in a losing battle. Interestingly, medieval monks were some of the cleanest folks around. Not because they liked being fresh and minty, but because religious rules told them to wash their hands and faces regularly. Monastic rules, like those of St. Benedict, actually required hand-washing before meals and foot-washing rituals as a form of service. There's a sweet, sleepy image for you, a quiet stone monastery, candlelight flickering, and a line of monks humbly washing each other's feet in total silence. But let's not romanticize it too much. Cleanliness was relative. A peasant might wash their face in a bucket of cold water once a week. That's about it. Baths were communal, which meant sharing cloudy water with your entire family, or half the town if you lived in a village. A sort of medieval hot tub party minus the fun plus some frogs. And you've got to remember, the smell of dirty was totally normal. Think about it. If your whole world smells like sweat, mud and animals, that's just baseline. It's not offensive. It's homey. In fact, the only people who really got sniffed at, literally, were those who tried to smell different. Like wealthy nobles dousing themselves in imported rosewater or rare perfumes from the Middle East. To your average medieval person, that flowery smell, totally suspicious. Maybe even a little witchy. Now let's talk about public baths. These were surprisingly common, especially in places like Paris, London, and across parts of the Islamic world, which actually had better hygiene standards than much of Europe. People would go to bathhouses to soak, gossip, eat snacks, and, well, other things. Yeah, bathhouses weren't always just about cleanliness. Some turned into social clubs, or even fronts for brothels. Eventually this led to growing concerns from church leaders who saw bathhouses as dangerous places of temptation. By the 14th century, that scandalous reputation, combined with the outbreak of the Black Death, led to many bathhouses being closed. People suddenly became terrified that bathing opened your pores to disease. This kicked off one of the most uncomfortable health trends ever. Avoiding baths on purpose to avoid getting sick. You'd just scrub your skin with linen cloths and throw on more perfume. The phrase better safe than sudsy may not have existed, but that was the vibe. Let's zoom in on one particularly strange idea. The miasma theory. This was the belief that bad smells caused disease. Not germs, those hadn't been discovered yet. Just foul air. That rotting pile of cabbage in the alley? Dangerous. A smelly goat in the courtyard? Possibly fatal. So instead of cleaning the source of the stink, people focused on covering it with strong scents. They hung posies from their belts, stuffed herbs into their clothes, and burned incense indoors. Did it work? Not really, but it made you feel like you were doing something, and sometimes that's enough. In wealthier homes, they might sprinkle rose petals on the floor to release a pleasant scent when stepped on. Kinda sweet, right? Until you realise they were trying to mask the stench of spilled food, mould, and probably something unspeakable from the corner. Still, points for effort. And there's a fun fringe fact for you. Medieval people believed that rubbing one's body with dry cloths was better than washing with water. The idea was that water softened the skin, made it weak, and opened the body to illness. So, rubbing your armpits with a dry rag, that was your shower. Kind of like medieval Febreze. Of course, there's a lot scholars still debate. Did peasants really avoid bathing, or were their habits just invisible to the record-keeping nobles and clergy? Did more frequent washing survive in warmer climates? How much of what we know comes from post-medieval writers trying to make their ancestors look backward and silly? Like most things in history, it's complicated, and probably smellier than we'll ever fully grasp. But for now, you've taken your first slow step into a world where hygiene is both strangely familiar and weirdly off. Where people tried to stay clean in a place constantly trying to make them dirty again. Where washing your hands could be a holy act, or a waste of precious firewood. And if you think this was gross, wait until we get to teeth. Your teeth hurt. You don't know why exactly, but there's this constant dull ache in your molar that makes you clench your jaw every time you chew something harder than boiled oats, which is most things, unfortunately. But it's 1287, and unless you know a barber surgeon who's not drunk that day, you're stuck with it. Toothache is just part of life, like cold feet and questionable soup. Welcome to medieval dental hygiene, where nobody's smiling much. And if they are, it's probably because they lost all their teeth, years ago. You might think the Middle Ages were a total dental disaster, and yeah, kind of, but not always in the way you'd expect. In some ways, they actually had a head start. You see, sugar wasn't widely available in Europe until the late Middle Ages, and even then, it was expensive, imported, and mostly consumed by the super wealthy. So for most peasants, it wasn't sugar that rotted their teeth. It was time, and grit, and age, and also the fact that their bread was ground with millstones that left behind little specks of stone dust. Which means, yes, your daily loaf of bread might be sanding down your enamel every time you chew it. As for actual cleaning, well, they tried. Tooth powders made from crushed herbs like mint, sage, or salt were used by those who could afford or access them. Sometimes people rubbed their teeth with a linen cloth dipped in vinegar. Sounds refreshing until you realise vinegar's acid probably made things worse in the long run. Some people even chewed on twigs, using the frayed ends like a primitive toothbrush. Honestly, not a bad idea. Modern miswax sticks work similarly. So not everything was terrible, just most of it. Now brace yourself, because here comes a fringe practice that's going to stick in your brain forever. Some medieval folks rinsed their mouths with urine. Human urine. Yeah. Apparently aged urine, left to sit for a while, was considered a cleansing agent. The ammonia content, legitimately strong. Whether it helped teeth or just burned everything into numbness is up for debate. Either way, it's a routine that makes mouthwash commercials feel like science fiction. And if you had a cavity, well, they didn't call it a cavity, you had a toothworm. Yes, a literal worm. The idea was that a tiny creature had burrowed into your tooth and was wriggling around in there, causing pain. There are written accounts of people trying to lure the worm out with burning herbs, smoke, and even music. Music! As if a worm was just hanging out in your incisor, waiting to hear its favourite tune before packing its bags and moving on. Barber surgeons were the ones who handled serious dental issues. These were the guys who also did bloodletting, amputations, and whatever else needed doing between haircuts. If a tooth needed pulling, they'd pry it out with iron tongs and zero anaesthetic. Just a good grip, a strong arm, and maybe a friend to hold your shoulders down. Not a fun day, but afterward, you might get a glass of ale and the vague promise that at least that one won't hurt anymore. Of course, not everyone had the same dental experience. Monks, again, were often better off, thanks to structured diets and access to herbal remedies. Nobles, on the other hand, could afford expensive sweets and preserved fruits soaked in honey, which ironically wrecked their teeth faster. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Many high-status skulls from the late Middle Ages show severe tooth decay, while peasants' remains often reveal worn-down but cavity-free teeth. So maybe you're lucky to be poor. Tooth-wise, anyway. There's also something oddly comforting in knowing that even back then people worried about their appearance. Bad breath? Still embarrassing. Some medieval guides recommended chewing fennel seeds or cloves to freshen up before speaking with others. There's something kind of timeless about a peasant nervously popping a clove before talking to their crush at the market. Same insecurity, different millennium. Of course, scholars still argue about just how widespread these practices really were. Were mouth-cleaning rituals just for the literate, upper classes who wrote about them? Or did ordinary people have their own unwritten traditions passed down orally? There's evidence from other cultures that chewing sticks and herbal remedies were common hygiene tools globally, so it's likely that some version of these existed across medieval Europe, even if they didn't make it into the dusty records we now read by candlelight. And while dental hygiene was hit or miss, teeth themselves played weird roles in medieval life. People believed toothache could be cured by wearing certain amulets, like a wolf's tooth strung around your neck, or by reciting prayers to St. Apollonia, the patron saint of toothaches who, no surprise here, had her own teeth violently removed as part of her martyrdom. Because apparently pain and holiness were deeply intertwined. Oh, and just for fun, one bizarre medical text suggested planting a tooth in a field and letting it grow to remove the ache, like dental farming. There's no evidence this worked, obviously, but there's a slow comfort in imagining some poor guy burying his molar in a patch of barley and praying for relief. It's desperate, it's sad, and it's a little poetic. So tonight, as you lie in bed with your comfortable minty toothpaste and your gently humming electric toothbrush safely tucked away, just know that you're living in peak dental luxury. No worms, no vinegar burns, no early morning tongs to the jaw, just smooth enamel and maybe a late-night snack without fear of triggering medieval-level mouth agony. And if you do have a toothache, at least you don't have to play the flute at it. You're heading to the bathhouse today, which in theory should be relaxing. Warm water, clean skin, maybe a chance to scrub off the livestock aroma you've accumulated this week. But of course this is the Middle Ages, so things are going to get weird fast. You walk into a steamy wooden building, your breath catching from the mix of moist heat and human musk. And suddenly, you're surrounded by half-naked people lounging in giant wooden tubs, chatting about everything from taxes to saints to someone's suspicious mole. It's less spa day, more lukewarm human soup. Bathhouses were surprisingly common in medieval towns, especially in places like England, France and the Low Countries. They weren't just for the upper crust either. Labourers, merchants, even peasants scraped together the coin for a communal soak now and then. Some cities had dozens of them, sometimes as popular as taverns. And if you're picturing rows of private baths and soothing harp music, no. This is a loud, social, slightly chaotic space. People bathe together, men and women alike in many cases, and nobody's in a rush. You're here to soak, gossip, and maybe nibble some bread and cheese while pruning up like a raisin. But that innocent loaf of bread leads us to the fringe part of bathhouses. They often doubled as places of business and pleasure. In many towns, bathhouses had an unsavoury reputation for mixing cleanliness with carnality. The line between steam room and steamy situation blurred pretty fast, especially in larger cities. This didn't sit well with the church, who preached, loudly and frequently, that bathhouses were dens of sin, temptation, and probably Satan himself lurking behind a curtain with a towel. By the 14th century, especially during times of plague, bathhouses were scrutinised, shut down, or heavily regulated. Still, people loved them, because let's be honest, the rest of medieval life was freezing, muddy and smelly. A hot bath, even shared with strangers and fleas, was a tiny luxury in a world of discomfort. And these weren't tiny tubs either. Some bathhouses had huge wooden vats, sometimes heated from below with actual fires. You'd soak, then step onto a platform to be scrubbed down with rough linen cloths, often by an attendant who may or may not be trained in the art of not hurting you. The idea was to get all that dead skin off. And believe me, they did not believe in gentle exfoliation. The goal was to scrape you clean, like a well-used soup pot. For a few coins more, you could even get scented oils rubbed onto your skin. Imported lavender, rosemary, rosewater, whatever was available or local. It sounds fancy, but it wasn't just about smelling nice. People believed strong scents protected them from disease. Remember miasma theory? Bad smells equals sickness, good smells equals protection. So slathering yourself in herbs was kind of like putting on medieval hand sanitizer, even if the science didn't quite hold up. Here's something even stranger. Bathhouses sometimes offered food service. You could literally eat a meal in the tub, surrounded by other steamy bodies. Stew in one hand, bread in the other, gossip, bouncing off the wooden walls. There's a quiet, sleepy charm to that image. Steam drifting up to the rafters, the clink of bowls, someone snorting mid-laugh as another person tries to convince them the butcher's apprentice is secretly a nobleman in disguise. But not all baths were in towns. Some people, especially in rural areas, made do with large tubs at home or even outdoor rivers if the weather allowed. These were private affairs, but still not what we'd call sanitary. Water was hauled, reused, and probably shared with the entire household in sequence. You'd want to be the first in. By the fourth person, that water was more stew than bath. And speaking of stew, let's not forget what happened after you got out. You didn't have fluffy towels and a robe waiting. More likely you dried off with something scratchy and maybe still damp from last time, then put your same old clothes back on, because clean outfits were a luxury. So yes, you were technically cleaner, but still wearing that tunic that absorbed 3 months of goat-based living. There's one particularly strange record from 15th century Germany where couples were encouraged to bathe together before marriage. Kind of sweet, right? A joint pre-wedding scrub. But it wasn't just symbolic. People believed shared bathing could promote harmony, intimacy, and maybe ensure the couple smelled equally tolerable. Still, scholars debate a lot about how often people really bathed. The records are patchy, and what survives often reflects urban or noble life. Rural folk may have washed less, or just did it differently. Some historians argue the idea of rare bathing was exaggerated by later writers trying to make their ancestors look primitive, sort of historical shaming. Others think the bathhouse culture was genuinely vibrant and widespread until diseases like the plague and syphilis turned water into a threat instead of a cure. And there's that ever-present fear: open pores. By the late 14th century, more and more people believed that hot baths left you vulnerable to disease. Open pores meant bad air could sneak into your body. So ironically, the very act of cleaning yourself was seen as a health risk. Over time, many people started wiping themselves with cloths instead of immersing in water. Dry bathing, less effective, more socially acceptable, and much, much sadder. So here you are, slowly drying off next to a stranger who just offered you a hunk of bread, thinking maybe life isn't so bad, until you remember you've got to walk home in freezing wind and that you'll be sleeping in the same lice-prone woolens you arrived in. But for a few fleeting moments, you were warm, you were cleanish, you were part of a world that knew how to turn communal discomfort into a kind of strange shared comfort. Just don't think too hard about what's floating in the tub. The soap you're using tonight could probably strip paint off a wagon wheel. It's gritty, slightly greasy, and smells like a mix of wood ash and something that died last Tuesday. But in the Middle Ages, this stuff is as close to luxury as it gets. Because here's the thing, soap wasn't always a household staple. It was an ordeal, part chemistry experiment, part kitchen fire hazard, and depending on where you lived, it might also be considered suspiciously exotic. Let's dig into the scratchy, sudsy, vaguely dangerous world of medieval soap making. First off, soap wasn't new. People in ancient Rome, Mesopotamia, and even early Celtic tribes had versions of it. But by the early Middle Ages, much of that knowledge got patchy. In some places, soap was made in big, smelly batches by boiling animal fat, usually goat or cow tallow, with ashes. You had to collect wood ash from hardwoods and then mix it with water to make lye. Yes, lye, the caustic burn-your-skin-off chemical that still comes with warning labels today. The process was not gentle, and if you got the proportions wrong, your soap either wouldn't clean anything or would take a layer of skin off along with the dirt. So congratulations, you're standing in your grimy cottage, sweating over a cauldron full of bubbling tallow and lye, desperately trying not to poison yourself while making what might turn out to be medieval napalm in bar form. Not exactly a Pinterest craft. That's why soap making often became a trade. In cities like Marseille, Aleppo, and Venice, professional soap makers, often under guild supervision, refined the craft and produced better quality bars, some scented with olive oil or imported herbs. These soaps were smoother, more fragrant, and wildly expensive. If you had one of these at home, it meant you were probably a merchant, a noble, or married to someone who could successfully dodge taxes. Most people, though, used the homemade stuff, or they didn't use soap at all and just scrubbed themselves with cloth, sand, or handfuls of straw. Yes, straw. Interestingly, in Islamic regions of the medieval world, soap making was more advanced. They perfected recipes using vegetable oils, particularly olive oil, and introduced techniques that produced softer, less caustic bars. These soaps made their way to Europe through trade and conquest, and for a while, using that kind of soap was seen as foreign, sophisticated, and slightly suspect. Because nothing says luxury hygiene like a bar of imported Aleppo soap that your neighbour believes is a tool of the devil. That's not an exaggeration either. Soap had an awkward reputation. Some Christian scholars associated cleanliness with vanity, and vanity with sin, so smelling nice or scrubbing too often might get you a few judgmental stares at church. There were even sermons warning women against perfumed temptation and men against softness of the flesh, which, translation, meant stop moisturizing or God might notice. Still, people made soap anyway, especially in towns where you couldn't just roll in the river mud and call it a day. They used what they had: pig fat, wood ash, and water, and the result? An incredibly hard, often stinky substance that sometimes worked and sometimes just made your skin feel like it was being punished. But hey, better than nothing. Soap also had other uses, weirdly enough. Some texts mention using strong soap to treat lice or skin conditions. In other cases, soap was part of purification rituals. Monks washed their hands and faces before prayer, using specific soaps made in monastic workshops. These were basic but symbolically important, part of a larger practice of spiritual cleanliness. Because if the body was a temple, even a very smelly one, it deserved a little lye-based maintenance now and then. But you want quirky? Let's go extra fringe. There's a surviving medieval recipe for soap that includes ox bile, ashes of burned grapevine, and, wait for it, goose grease. The instructions are vague, the quantities nonsensical, and the warnings non-existent. But someone wrote it down, which means someone made it, and quite possibly survived using it. Barely. Now imagine being a peasant trying to store this homemade bar of experimental sludge. You didn't have a soap dish. You had maybe a damp corner of your shared sleeping space or a kitchen shelf near the turnips, and over time your soap bar would get weirdly soft, start melting into a slimy puddle, or dry into a rock-hard slab that could double as a weapon in a tavern brawl. There's also a debate among scholars about how widespread regular soap use actually was. Some argue it was a luxury, used more for laundry than for personal hygiene. Others believe it was more common than we think but underrepresented in written records, which tend to focus on elites and church practices. Maybe everyone had some rough chunk of it drying by the fire, but nobody thought to mention it because, well, it was just soap, not exciting unless it exploded. And that's something worth remembering. The past wasn't all filth and ignorance. People wanted to be clean. They figured things out. Trial and error, mostly error, but still. That humble, stinky bar of soap in your imagination right now, that was effort, that was time, that was animal fat rendered over hours, probably while kids screamed and the dog tried to eat the cooling lye bucket. So tonight, as you lather up in your perfectly balanced coconut-scented body wash, just picture some medieval villager standing by a bubbling cauldron of goat fat and firewood smoke, squinting into the steam and muttering, "Maybe if I add more ash." They didn't have pH strips or lab coats, just hope, trial runs, and a high tolerance for burns. And maybe, just maybe, their hands came out a little cleaner if they didn't melt first. You wake up itchy, not because you're sick or allergic, but because you made the classic mistake of sleeping too close to the hearth last night, and now you're full of soot and whatever mystery dust floats around in a thatched roof cottage. You'd think a good scrub would fix it, but you hesitate. Because, and this is going to sound completely backward, you're not sure if bathing is actually safe. In fact, you've heard it might kill you. Welcome to one of the stranger twists in medieval hygiene logic. Water can be dangerous, and not in the I can't swim way, in the this bath will let the plague into your body way. It wasn't always like this. Early medieval folks enjoyed bathing, and as we've already seen, bathhouses were bustling. But somewhere between the 14th and 16th centuries, a cultural shift started brewing, and it had everything to do with fear. Fear of disease, fear of temptation, and fear that your own body, exposed and relaxed in warm water, was basically a welcome mat for every nasty illness floating in the air. The popular theory at the time, open pores were an open invitation, literally. People thought the skin opened up in heat, and once it did, any disease nearby would slither right in. A hot bath? That was like shouting, "Come on in, bubonic plague, I just exfoliated for you." You can blame the miasma theory for that, the belief that bad air caused sickness. If the air stank, it must be full of disease. And guess what a steamy, communal bathhouse full of sweaty bodies smelled like? Exactly. To many, it became obvious. Bathing wasn't just useless, it was risky. Suddenly, being clean was suspect. It was safer to stay dirty. let your pores crust over with grime like a protective seal. Filth as armour. Honestly, it's almost poetic in its grossness. And this fear didn't stay on the fringes. It reached kings and queens. Queen Isabella of Castile reportedly bathed only twice in her life, once at birth and once on her wedding night. Whether that's true or just dramatic propaganda, it tells you something about the image of cleanliness. It wasn't admirable. It was indulgent and potentially reckless. Being grimy meant you were strong, serious, holy even. Saints didn't bathe, why should you? But not everyone took this to the extreme. In some places, especially warmer southern regions like Italy or parts of Spain, people bathed more frequently. Public baths stayed open longer, and personal hygiene was still considered part of good living. In contrast, up north, where water was cold, firewood was expensive, and illness spread fast, the avoid the tub policy gained traction. By the 1500s, dry cleaning your body with cloths and scented powders became far more common, especially among the nobility. Smelling decent without ever touching water. Now that was a skill. And let's be real, bathing in the Middle Ages wasn't like hopping into a modern shower with temperature control and a calming eucalyptus playlist. You had to boil water over a fire, pour it into a big wooden tub, often leaky, and hope your roof didn't drop a dead bird on you halfway through. Also, privacy wasn't really a thing. If you had a family, they probably bathed in the same water after you. So by the time you were clean, your brother, sister, dad, mum, and possibly your neighbour's goat had turned that bath into a human stew. Not exactly refreshing. Here's your weird fact for the night. Some people believed rainwater was more dangerous than well water because it had touched the sky, and the sky was full of corrupt vapours, which is a fancy way of saying clouds were suspicious. A few medical guides even warned against using rainwater for washing, claiming it could unbalance your humours or weaken your blood. So if you're thinking, at least they could rinse off in a good storm. Nope, they were afraid of clouds. Now, if you were really fancy, you might have access to perfumed water. Royalty in particular had special tubs carved from marble or wood, and attendants who would mix oils and flower extracts into the water. Sounds luxurious, right? Until you remember they were still terrified of washing too often. So while they might sit in a beautiful tub, they'd do it rarely, and usually only if a physician told them it would realign their internal temperatures. Because again, this wasn't about dirt, it was about balance. Wash too much, and you could upset the delicate cocktail of hot, cold, wet and dry that made up your body, which could, of course, kill you. Doctors, well, the guys who called themselves doctors were all in on this. Medical texts from the period are full of contradictions. Some recommend a warm bath to loosen phlegm and stimulate digestion. Others warn that water weakens the nerves and stirs up ill humours, so basically, bath if you feel gross, but also don't bath or you'll die. Helpful. There's even debate among modern scholars about whether this anti-bathing mindset was as widespread as we think. Some argue that it was more of a post-plague panic that didn't fully represent everyday behaviour. Others think it was deeply entrenched, especially among those who could afford alternative methods like perfumes and scented powders. The truth probably lies somewhere in the muddy middle. People weren't totally filthy monsters, but they definitely had a complicated relationship with water, equal parts desire and dread. So tonight, when you step into your warm chlorinated shower, just remember, you're doing something your medieval self might have feared deeply, not because of superstitions or rituals, but because the very idea of bathing was tangled in theology, medicine, and economics. Cleanliness wasn't just about dirt, it was a philosophical gamble. And the next time you complain about a lukewarm shower, imagine crouching in a wooden tub, rain tapping the thatch above, your pores supposedly flung wide open, while someone tells you this is how demons get in. It's early morning in your little medieval town and something sloshes past your front door. You hear the unmistakable splash, a squelch, maybe even a startled yell from a passerby who wasn't fast enough with their reflexes. You don't panic. That's just someone dumping their chamber pot into the street. Again, business as usual. Because in the Middle Ages, waste disposal was basically out of sight, out the window. There were no flush toilets, of course. No indoor plumbing, no tidy porcelain thrones. What you had, if you were lucky, was a chamber pot. A simple ceramic or wooden bowl you tucked under the bed or beside a stool. You did your business there, day or night, and when it got full, you or someone in your household, read the youngest, lowest rankings person, would chuck it out the window. preferably after yelling something like "Gardeloo" or "Where below" to warn anyone walking past. Hopefully they got out of the way in time. If not, well, unfortunate. Streets weren't paved in most towns and certainly not cleaned often. They were a combination of mud, horse droppings, straw, rotting food, and the daily contribution from your upstairs neighbour's bladder. Many towns had a central gutter, or kennel, designed to carry waste downhill and away from town. In theory. In practice, that gutter, clogged, backed up, often became a putrid ribbon through the heart of the city. The smell! Imagine a compost pile had a heated argument with a wet dog. But worse. Now, let's talk about the real heroes of medieval sanitation. The night soil men. These were the folks, usually paid very little, who emptied cesspits and privies, especially in larger towns and castles. They worked after dark, hauling barrels of human waste to dumps or fields outside the city where it was sometimes used as fertiliser. Yes, your lettuce may have enjoyed a generous helping of Lord Melvin's leftovers. Night soil men were essential, but also deeply looked down upon. People avoided them in public, yet relied on them completely. A thankless job if ever there was one. If you lived in a city with some actual infrastructure, you might have access to a guardrobe. This was a narrow little stone room built into castle or manor walls, with a hole that dropped waste directly into the moat or a pit below. There's even a delightful term for the build-up that collected in those pits over decades: cess sludge. Thick, dark, and incredibly valuable to archaeologists today, who dig through it for clues about diet, disease, and parasites. You're welcome, future scholars. Now here's a fringe fact you'll wish you didn't know. Some guardrobes were designed above the kitchens. That's right. The idea was that the heat from the kitchen fires would warm the stone seat and maybe help with the smell. Spoiler, it didn't. There's something deeply unsettling about pooping directly above the soup. But let's say you lived in the country. No castle, no chamber pot, just fields. What did you do then? You found a bush, a tree, dug a hole, or not. Open defecation was common, especially among poorer folks. They didn't have the luxury of designated waste areas, and there wasn't much shame in it either. Just something you did quickly, hopefully not in view of your neighbours or livestock. That brings us to a rarely discussed medieval accessory, the humble wiping tool. Toilet paper? Not a thing. Instead, people used moss leaves, hay, scraps of cloth, or their hands followed by rinsing with water, if available. Some wealthier folks might keep bits of linen nearby for this purpose. In monasteries, monks used a device called a gomph stick, a smooth wooden spatula of sorts. Functional, frightening, not exactly charm-in, and yet there was some thoughtfulness in how public and communal facilities were laid out. In larger monasteries, for instance, there were multi-seat latrines built with running water underneath, often placed over a stream or designed with a flow system. Not hygienic by modern standards, but miles ahead of a bucket behind a curtain. Some of these still exist today as eerie stone benches with evenly spaced holes, an echo of quiet shared moments in the most vulnerable human position. Of course, all of this waste had consequences. Disease ran rampant, particularly in dense cities. Cholera, dysentery, and other lovely ailments were part of daily life, not because people didn't care, but because they didn't understand germ theory. To them, the smell was the threat. If you could mask the odour, you could clean the air, which is why they threw down herbs, burned incense, or scattered rushes and lavender on the floor. It wasn't about covering filth with fragrance, it was about warding off death with something nice-smelling. The question scholars still chew on is this: did people think this was normal, and they even noticed the smell? Some argue that medieval noses were more accustomed to daily grime, and people genuinely didn't find it offensive unless it was extreme. Others think they did notice, but without alternatives, they just learned to live with it. Like background noise, but way worse. And then there's the philosophical side of it. Dirt and waste were seen as part of the divine order. You were born, you lived, you excreted, and you died. Trying to hide that reality too much was almost vain, unnatural. Medieval culture had a strange mix of reverence and practicality when it came to bodily functions. Everybody did it, even the king, so why act like it was shameful? So tonight, as you flush your sleek ceramic water-saving toilet with its chrome lever and soft close lid, take a moment to appreciate it. No yelling out the window, no chamber pot shuffle. No stepping into the street and praying the upstairs neighbour had good aim. You live in a world of sewer systems and sanitation codes, a world where people are paid to make sure you never have to think about this stuff. Unlike the guy walking past your window in 1345 who just got hit with your leftovers again. You're walking through a crowded medieval market when the smell hits you. It's not the fishmonger's table or the pig pen in the corner. Those are pretty standard. This scent is sharper, sweeter, maybe floral, and somehow it doesn't belong. You follow your nose through a maze of mud and animal dung and sweaty wool until you find her, a woman with flowers braided into her hair, a sachet of herbs hanging from her belt, and what looks like a lemon peel tucked into her sleeve. She smells nice, and that, in the Middle Ages, makes her instantly suspicious. Let's talk about medieval scent culture, because people did care. They didn't walk around joyfully festering in their own grime. In fact, scent was a huge part of daily life, not just for comfort, but for health, protection, even morality. A good scent wasn't just pleasant, it was virtuous. A bad one, dangerous. You stank, you sinned, you suffered. That was the trifecta. So people did what they could to smell better, or at least less terrifying. Perfume existed, though it wasn't like the alcohol-based sprays we know today. Instead, it came in the form of scented oils, vinegars, pastes, sachets, and incense. Some were dabbed on skin, others were placed in clothing folds, tucked under pillows, or worn around the neck in pomanders, those little metal or wooden balls filled with herbs and resins that jingled slightly with every step. They were part fashion accessory, part protective amulet, part, please don't judge me, I tried. The ingredients were wild and wonderfully inconsistent. Rosewater was hugely popular, made by steeping rose petals in water and used for everything from perfume to cooking to facial rinses. Lavender, sage, rosemary and bay were common in sachets. The elite could access musk, ambergris or civet, musky animal secretions that today would earn a phone call to animal control, but back then were the Chanel No. 5 of the day. Expensive, exotic, probably made by someone in Persia or Egypt and carried to Europe on the backs of a dozen tired camels. Of course, the average peasant wasn't wearing imported musk or distilled rose oil. They worked with what grew nearby: juniper, thyme, mint, crushed herbs rubbed into the skin, bundles hung inside tunics. Some people even carried little cloths soaked in vinegar to press against their nose in crowded places. It didn't just smell nice, it was armour against disease, miasma theory again. Bad air kills you, good air saves you. And this led to some truly quirky practices. Some wealthier women would place sliced citrus peels inside their gloves so their hands always smelled like fruit. Others put cloves into their shoes or scented wax in their hair, not just for the delight of it, but because they believed smell could influence the soul. A pure scent meant a pure heart. A foul smell? Well, guess who's probably going to hell? That brings us to the fascinating and totally creepy intersection of hygiene and morality. Good smell equaled goodness. Bad smell meant sin. And in a world where plague was blamed on divine punishment, smelling bad wasn't just socially awkward. It was spiritually damning. This created a kind of sensory class divide. If you were rich enough to afford scents, oils and herbal balms, you could at least pretend to be righteous. If you stank like a turnip farmer in August, maybe you had some explaining to do. But even the nobility struggled. Castle life was stuffy and smoky, ventilation was a joke, you had unwashed dogs, sweaty servants, and the occasional decomposing boar carcass hanging in the pantry. So nobles fought back with scent. They lined their walls with fragrant herbs, burned incense daily, and sometimes even washed their clothing in scented water. Not because it helped, just because it made suffering feel fancier. There's a hilarious but true fringe story about Charles VI of France, who believed his body was made of glass and might shatter. He avoided bathing and preferred to be surrounded by scented oils instead. His physicians encouraged this, believing strong aromas could keep his fragile body solid. No word on how that worked out, but we can guess. Poorly. Then there were plague doctors. You've seen the beaked masks, right? They weren't for style. Those long snouts were stuffed with herbs, spices, and dried flowers. The idea was that by breathing only through scented filters, the doctors could avoid catching the plague. Again, not accurate science, but the intention was there. Breathe in goodness, block out death. It wasn't just humans either. People perfumed their homes, their beds, even their animals. Horses had herbal garlands, dogs wore scented collars, monks sprinkled rosewater on monastery floors. You name it, someone tried to make it smell better. And when the stench of life crept back in, as it always did, they simply doubled down. More sage, more mint. Burn another handful of bay leaves. Maybe tomorrow won't reek quite as much. And yet, despite all the effort, the scholarly debate continues. Were medieval people constantly fighting stench or just occasionally masking it when it got too strong? Did the elite really smell better or just different? Was scent more about health or hierarchy? It's hard to say because most records were written by people who had access to herbs and perfumes and didn't often describe the lives of those who didn't. But the archaeological evidence, the scented pots, pomanders, herbal bundles, suggests a deep daily relationship with smell across many classes. So tonight, as your lavender-scented pillowcase cradles your freshly washed face, think about that woman in the market. Her lemon peel, her crushed rosemary sachet, her softly jingling pomander. In a world of rot and disease and smoky nights, she carried a little bubble of clean air with her, one sniff at a time. And if anyone stared too long, maybe it wasn't because she smelled nice. Maybe it was because they were wondering, is she holy or just hiding something? You've been walking for days, your feet wrapped in scratchy wool, your boots slowly giving up on their structural integrity. You've crossed muddy roads, slept beside a pig pen, and eaten nothing but hard bread and dried fish. Your cloak smells like damp mildew, and whatever was in that mysterious stew back in the last village. Still you press on. Why? Because you're a pilgrim, and if you think this journey is spiritually cleansing, it's definitely not physically cleansing. In fact, the longer you walk, the more you stink like a divine garbage heap. Welcome to the world of medieval pilgrimage where everyone was equally smelly, and nobody cared. Pilgrimages were a big deal. People from all over Europe travelled, sometimes hundreds of miles, to reach sacred destinations. Santiago de Compostela, Canterbury, Rome, Jerusalem. The motivations were mixed. Some went to repent, others sought healing, indulgences, or just an excuse to get out of town for a while. But one thing united them. After a few days on the road, every single pilgrim smelled like a combination of sweat, wet wool, and spiritual determination. You might think there'd be stops to wash along the way, and there were, sort of. Some monasteries and hospices welcomed pilgrims with food, shelter, and occasionally access to a bath. But let's not kid ourselves. These were usually communal tubs, lukewarm at best, often already full of other crusty travellers who hadn't seen a bar of soap in 3 seasons. And the time pressure to keep moving, plus the fear that too much washing would weaken your already tired body, meant most people skipped the bath altogether. Clothes didn't fare much better. Pilgrims typically owned one outfit, maybe 2 if they were fancy. Washing clothes while on the road was possible, but it meant carrying wet fabric on your back all day, which could chill you to the bone or make your pack smell like damp goose feathers. So instead, you let your cloak absorb the journey, the miles, the miracles, the bad ale you spilled on yourself 3 towns ago. It became a scent map of your devotion. Still, there were ways to manage the odour. Pilgrims often carried herbal sachets, bundles of dried lavender, thyme, or mint to tuck into their sleeves or belts. Not only did they help mask the stench, they also kept insects away and offered protection against illness. Or so they believed. Pilgrim staffs were sometimes carved with little notches to hold scented charms, and in towns along the way, local vendors sold rosewater or scented vinegar to freshen up before entering shrines or churches. Nobody wanted to stand in line next to someone who smelled like they died halfway through the trip. Oddly enough, the universal stink created a kind of equality. Rich or poor, noble or peasant, everyone was trudging through the same mud, under the same sun, stewing in their own spiritual broth. Status blurred. Smell levelled the playing field. You could be a duke and still look and smell like a goat herder after a week on the road. In some ways, the smell was the badge, proof of sacrifice. You weren't just strolling through the countryside, you were suffering. And suffering was holy. You gave up your comforts, your routine, your bath privileges, all for a glimpse of a relic or a whispered prayer at a holy site. Pilgrims returned home with badges and tokens, but also with lice, cracked feet, and the kind of body odour that could be carbon dated by archaeologists. There's a strange fringe belief that grew out of this, that a certain kind of holy stink was pleasing to God. Some saints were described as giving off sweet smells when they died, incorruptible bodies that smelled like flowers. So naturally, some began to speculate that the smell of piety wasn't always unpleasant. Maybe that funky pilgrim musk. Maybe that was the scent of devotion. Some chroniclers went out of their way to describe how bad a group of pilgrims smelled when arriving in town. Not as an insult, but as a sign they'd travelled far and were thus more worthy. One monk even wrote that he could tell a pilgrim's origin by how long the smell lingered after they left the chapel. A whole theology of travel-based BO. Pilgrimage routes often had built-in stops at sacred springs or healing wells. These offered the rare opportunity for a rinse, and not just for hygiene. Bathing in holy water was believed to heal sickness or cleanse sins. So now and then you'd get a real bath. Cold, sacred, probably full of algae, but glorious. And afterward, you'd probably just slip your mouldy tunic back on and keep walking. Progress. Scholars continue to debate just how rough these journeys really were. Some argue that pilgrims cleaned themselves more often than records suggest, particularly in southern climates where natural springs were abundant. Others point to contemporary complaints about reek and rot following pilgrims into churches as evidence that many went full grime mode. The truth again is likely somewhere in the middle. A few made time to clean, most didn't. And by the end, everyone smelled like something that should be left outside overnight. But for the devout, none of that mattered. You were walking for your soul, for redemption, for the chance to kiss the shrine of a martyred saint who'd been dead for 500 years and probably never bathed either. You weren't here for a spa day. You were here to suffer, and if you smelled like fermented onions wrapped in damp wool, good, that meant it was working. So tonight, as you climb into your clean bed, your feet soft from slippers and your skin scented with fabric softener, picture yourself on that pilgrimage road, the sky low and grey, the wind sharp with coming rain, your only protection a wool cloak crusted with old broth and dried sweat, and yet, in the eyes of your fellow travellers, you're glowing. Not because you're clean, but because you're trying. And in the Middle Ages, trying, even stinkily, was enough. You start your morning with a drink, not tea, not coffee. Those are luxuries you've never even heard of. No, today you pour yourself a nice hearty mug of ale. It's warm, slightly sour, and maybe has a few bits of something floating in it, but you don't complain. Because in the Middle Ages, ale isn't just a drink. It's survival. It's breakfast, and in many places, it's safer than water. Let's back up. Water wasn't always dangerous in the medieval world, but it was often suspicious. Streams could be polluted by animals or waste runoff. Wells could be contaminated by nearby cesspits, or the neighbour's not-so-secret habit of dumping everything into the same spot. And stagnant ponds were basically petri dishes with ducks. People didn't understand bacteria, but they did understand that water sometimes made you violently ill, so they turned to brewing, because if you're going to get sick from drinking something, it might as well give you a buzz on the way down. Ale was everywhere. Not the strong stuff we think of today, but something lighter, more like liquid bread. It was made from barley, water and sometimes oats or wheat boiled during the brewing process, which killed off many of the harmful pathogens that would have happily multiplied in a plain bucket of river water. Once fermented, it was cloudy, thick and mildly alcoholic. Just enough to make you feel warm, not enough to make you fall into a haystack before noon. Unless, of course, you had several mugs. And who could blame you? Even children drank ale, not out of some medieval version of bad parenting, but because small beer, what we'd now call table beer, had low alcohol content and was genuinely safer than the local well. You'd find little kids running around with mugs, chasing chickens and taking sips like it was apple juice, which it very much was not. But you try telling a 5-year-old to drink from the frog pond instead. Not happening. There were entire households, especially among peasants, where the act of brewing was a daily or weekly ritual, almost always handled by women. Alewives, as they were called, were crucial to the local economy. They brewed small batches, sold them from their homes or doorsteps, and became local legends in the process. You knew which neighbour's brew would knock you sideways, and which one added too much bog myrtle, and made everyone hiccup for 3 days straight. It was trial and error, sometimes heavy on the error. And speaking of bog myrtle, there's your fringe detail for the night. Before hops became standard in brewing, people flavoured their ale with all kinds of herbs. Yarrow, heather, mugwort, and yes, bog myrtle, a plant with a lovely name and a deeply strange taste. These herbs weren't just for flavour, they were believed to have preservative or even medicinal properties. Hops, which give beer that bitter edge we know today, didn't become widespread in England until the late Middle Ages, and even then some folks thought they were foreign, dangerous, or just downright rude. Hopped beer was something the Germans did. You know, them. In larger towns, brewing became more centralised. Monasteries had some of the best breweries and monks took it seriously. Beer wasn't just sustenance, it was spiritual. After all, God made barley, and fermentation was kind of magical. Monastic breweries followed detailed recipes, maintained quality, and in many cases, created early versions of the beer styles we know today. Trappist ales? Their great-great-grandparents might have been bubbling away in a barrel behind a cloister wall in the 1200s. Of course, drinking ale all day came with its own problems. Not everyone could handle it. Chronic drunkenness was a thing, even if most medieval ale had less punch than modern beer. People built up a tolerance, sure, but you still had those villagers who took it too far. There are records of men falling into wells, trying to ride pigs, or singing love songs to chimney sweeps after 3 too many mugs. The Middle Ages were chaotic enough sober. But here's the paradox: even though ale was everywhere, being drunk wasn't always accepted. The church warned against drunkenness as a sin, not the drinking itself, just the overindulgence. Like most things medieval, it was about balance. Drink enough to avoid dying of dysentery, but not so much you forget your own name and try to wrestle the parish priest during vespers. Moderation, medieval style. And still the debate goes on. Some historians argue that the idea of ale as a water substitute has been exaggerated, that clean water was used for drinking in many places, especially rural areas with fresh springs. Others stand firm. The boiling and fermenting process made ale safer, and that made it the beverage of choice. The truth is, it probably depended on the season, the location, and whether or not someone upstream had just dumped a goat carcass into the river. So tonight, picture yourself sitting by a smoky hearth, your hands wrapped around a wooden mug. Your ale is thick, lukewarm, and has a vaguely bread-like smell. You sip it slowly, it fills your belly. It takes the edge off the morning chill. And even though you'll drink it again at midday and supper, you don't get bored of it. It's part of life, like wool cloaks, cold floors, and the occasional leech. And the best part, you know it won't give you the runs. Probably. You sit down to dinner, and right away you know something's off. The meat smells aggressive, like it's been alive a little too long after dying, if that makes sense. The colours are shade darker than usual. The texture suspiciously slippery. But no one else at the table seems alarmed. In fact, they're already tearing in with their hands, laughing, talking, dipping hunks of bread into juices you pray weren't scraped off the kitchen floor. So you take a breath, say a prayer, and take a bite. It's tough, salty, and oddly spicy. Congratulations, you're experiencing the culinary wonders of medieval meat preservation, where if your stew doesn't try to escape the bowl, you consider it a good day. Food in the Middle Ages wasn't always bad, but it was limited. Preservation was a constant struggle. There were no fridges or freezers, no cling wrap or cold storage. Meat was salted, dried, or smoked to keep it from turning rancid. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, which is why spices became the medieval cook's best friend. And also why they were so incredibly expensive. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, these weren't just flavour enhancers, they were survival tools. You weren't seasoning for fun, you were seasoning to survive the experience. The idea that spices were only used to mask spoiled food is debated. Some historians argue that meat was mostly eaten fresh, especially among the upper classes, and spices were more about showing off wealth than hiding rot. But let's be real, if you've just spent a week transporting a side of beef across half a county in midsummer, you're going to throw every spice in the cupboard at it and hope it stops twitching. Which brings us to the medieval love affair with heavily seasoned dishes. Some surviving recipes, especially from elite households, read like they were written by someone who lost a bet. Pork with almond milk, raisins, ginger, saffron and rosewater, sure. Fish soaked in vinegar, honey and cinnamon, why not? The goal was complexity, intensity, and enough layers of flavour to distract you from the underlying reality. This probably shouldn't be eaten, but we're going to do it anyway. The wealthy often had access to fresh meat from nearby estates or live animals butchered on demand. But even they weren't immune to the occasional off chicken. Hence the kitchens in castles and manors were often located far from the main hall, not just to manage smoke and noise, but to keep the less than pleasant smells away from polite company. Out of sight, out of nostril. Peasants, on the other hand, didn't eat much meat at all. It was expensive, taxed, and often reserved for feast days. When they did get some, it was usually in the form of salted pork or bacon, which could last longer, thanks to a generous coating of salt and lots of drying. Or it might be offal, organ meats that no one else wanted. Hearts, livers, kidneys, boiled, spiced, and served with cabbage. If you were lucky. If not, you ate gruel again. Fish was a common meat substitute, especially during religious fasts, which were frequent and strictly observed. Lent, Fridays, vigil days, they all meant no meat. So dried cod, herring and eel were everywhere. Eel pies were actually popular, let that image sink in. A pie full of eels, and people liked it. Fringe fact of the night? In some parts of Europe, beaver tails were considered fish because they were scaly and lived in water. The church signed off on it. So did puffins. Yep, if it swam, flew, or looked vaguely wet, it might count as a Lenten-friendly meal. Puffin stew? Technically holy. Even bread, the humble staple, had its issues. You'd think it was a safe bet, but the grain was often contaminated with fungus, especially rye. One in particular, called ergot, caused hallucinations, muscle spasms, and in extreme cases, death. Whole villages would fall into mass fits, dancing uncontrollably, screaming, seeing visions. Historians call it St. Anthony's fire. You eat some mouldy rye bread and suddenly you're seeing dragons in your goat pen. Not ideal. To combat spoilage, cooks turned to sauces, thick, spiced, vinegar-heavy concoctions designed to drown flavour and add shelf life. Many were sweet and sour, a combination that seems strange today but was all the rage back then. You'd roast a chicken and then smother it in something that tasted like pickled fruit punch, or boil pork with prunes and cinnamon and serve it cold. If that sounds odd to you, imagine how it tasted to someone who had never had chocolate sauce on tomatoes, potatoes or chili peppers. Didn't exist yet. Scholars still debate how widespread the use of spices was. Some think only the rich could afford them in quantity. Others argue that even peasants sometimes accessed small amounts. Peppercorns passed down in inheritance documents, cloves purchased for weddings or funerals. What's certain is that spices were status. If your food smelled exotic, you were winning, even if it made you gag a little. Presentation mattered too. For banquets, dishes were often dyed with natural colours. Saffron for yellow, beetroot for red, spinach for green. You might serve a roasted swan with its feathers reattached, posed like it was about to take flight. Or a meat pie shaped like a castle, complete with little pastry battlements. It was a culinary arms race. Who could outfeast whom, even if half the guests left with indigestion and regrets. So tonight, as you open your fridge to a selection of safe, regulated, neatly labelled food, consider what you've avoided. No guessing if the mutton's just a little sour. No scraping mould off your bread and hoping it's the harmless kind. No eel surprise or beaver tail fillet. Just options, temperature control, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you're not hallucinating because of breakfast. Medieval people didn't expect food to be perfect. They expected it to be edible enough, and if it wasn't, well, that's why you wash it down with ale. The bread in your hand is rock hard, slightly grey, and covered in what you hope is flour. You knock it against the table just to be sure it's edible, and it makes a dull thunk like a small drum. That's how you know it's good. Welcome to the daily loaf of the Middle Ages, where bread is life, but also a little dangerous, occasionally psychedelic, and sometimes used as an eating utensil. Grab a slice and hold on tight. Bread was the cornerstone of medieval diets across Europe. Whether you were a wealthy noble or a dirt-poor farmhand, you ate bread. Lots of it. The quality, though, varied wildly depending on your status and where you lived. Nobles got the good stuff, fine white bread made from sifted wheat flour known as manchet. It was soft, pale, and baked by professionals. If you were high-ranking enough, someone might even test your bread for poison before dinner. Just another perk of being rich and paranoid. Peasants, meanwhile, got what was called maslin, a hearty, dense bread made from a mix of grains like rye, barley, and whatever else they could scrounge together that season. It was filling, yes, but also heavy and sometimes gritty. And here's the reason: the grain was ground in stone mills, which occasionally let tiny bits of stone dust or grit into the flour. Over time, this wore down your teeth, so by age 40, you were probably chewing with stumps and swallowing carefully. You didn't just eat bread, you sandpapered your molars with it. Still, bread wasn't just food, it was infrastructure. Literally. In many households, especially the poorer ones, bread doubled as a dish. You'd take a hunk of stale loaf, called a trencher, and pile stew, meat, or vegetables on top. After the meal, you had 3 choices. For the soggy bread, give it to the poor or toss it to the dogs. It soaked up everything. Not just gravy, but also every disease your neighbour might have coughed into the communal bowl. Delicious, but it gets weirder. Let's talk about ergot. This fungus infects rye, and when consumed it can cause convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and even death. It's known today as ergotism, but back then it was called St. Anthony's fire. Infected bread caused entire villages to erupt in mysterious illnesses, people twitching and screaming in the streets, convinced they were being burned from the inside out. Others claimed to see visions of angels or demons. Imagine trying to enjoy your breakfast while the guy across the table is speaking in tongues and trying to marry a fence post. There are theories that ergotism may have even inspired some of the mass hysterias of the time, like the infamous dancing plagues, where entire groups would suddenly start dancing uncontrollably, unable to stop for days. It wasn't all catchy tunes and good vibes, it was exhaustion, injury, and sometimes fatal heart attacks, all from a loaf of rye that should have stayed in the oven just a little longer. To prevent such mishaps, some people learned to spot infected grain, but detection wasn't perfect. Millers and bakers might have suspicions, but the pressure to use every scrap of food often outweighed caution. Waste nothing was a hard rule. If you had bread that was mouldy but not too mouldy, you probably ate it anyway and just hoped your dinner didn't come with a side of spiritual possession. And even if the grain was clean, bread could still cause trouble. During famines, bakers sometimes stretched flour with questionable fillers, sawdust, chalk, ground up beans, or even clay, anything to bulk up the dough. There were actual laws in some cities forbidding bakers from cheating customers this way. If caught, the punishment could include being dunked in a river or paraded around with a loaf tied to your neck like a failed magician's trick. The public humiliation was meant to send a message: mess with bread and you mess with everyone. Because bread wasn't just food, it was symbolic. In religious rituals, in oaths, in deals made and sealed over a crusty loaf, bread was sacred, it was community. It was something that bound people together, even when everything else was falling apart. Churches gave it to the poor. Lords distributed it during feasts. It was one of the few things you could count on to show up at every table, rich or poor. One quirky side fact: some bakers were required by law to provide extra loaves with every dozen sold, a practice called the baker's dozen. The fear of punishment for shorting customers was so strong that tossing in an extra loaf became standard practice. No one wanted to be caught light on flour. Scholars still debate how widespread ergot poisoning really was. Some say it's overhyped, a convenient modern explanation for medieval weirdness. Others argue it was a major health issue that just didn't get properly recorded, hidden behind vague terms like fever, madness, or demonic possession. The archaeological evidence, charred bread loaves, weirdly bent skeletons, rural accounts of bad harvest years, suggests something was definitely happening even if the mould itself can't be dug up intact. So tonight, as you bite into your soft, crusty, evenly baked sourdough, or toast, or croissant, or whatever perfect modern carb you've got, think about your medieval counterpart gnawing on a dense hunk of barley millet mystery. Maybe a little chewy, maybe a little stone-filled, possibly a bit cursed, but still warm from the oven and worth every tooth it took with it. Because in the end, bread wasn't about luxury. It was about getting through the day, about filling your belly just enough to go dig, plough, mend, and start the whole thing over again tomorrow. And if it made you see angels while you did it, well, maybe that was just a bonus. You sit down for dinner at a wealthy merchant's table and something glints beside your plate. It's shiny, elegant, slightly menacing. A fork. Yes, a fork. And everyone around you looks mildly alarmed that you've just picked it up. Because here in the late Middle Ages, using a fork to eat your food is either suspiciously foreign, dangerously decadent, or just plain unnecessary. Why use a tiny metal pitchfork when God already gave you 10 perfectly good fingers? Believe it or not, forks were controversial. They'd existed in the Byzantine Empire for centuries, used by the elite to eat sticky or slippery foods, and by the 11th century, they made their way into parts of Italy through trade and intermarriage with Eastern nobility. But the reaction? Not great. One infamous story tells of a Venetian noblewoman who used golden forks at her wedding feast, only to be accused later of vanity, wastefulness, and pride. When she died of the plague shortly after, some claimed it was divine punishment for her inappropriate use of tableware. That's how strong fork phobia was. So while you're daintily stabbing a piece of boiled parsnip, your host is nervously tearing bread in half, wiping his hands on the tablecloth and pretending not to notice your modern audacity. You're making everyone uncomfortable and you don't even know it. For most of the Middle Ages, people ate with their hands, spoons and knives. Spoons were common and widely accepted, perfect for porridge, soup and anything mushy. Knives were essential both for cutting and for shoveling food toward your mouth. In fact, people often brought their own knives to meals, like BYOK, but less Pinterest and more don't get stabbed during dessert. Tables weren't always stocked with utensils, so if you forgot your knife, good luck eating that full roast. But fingers were king. You'd tear meat apart, dip it into sauce, and share trenchers, those big slabs of bread we talked about, between 2 or 3 people. Communal eating was the norm. Manners mattered, but they were different from ours. You didn't blow your nose into the tablecloth, you didn't wipe your mouth on your sleeve, and you definitely didn't lick your fingers and go back for more stew unless you wanted someone to accidentally knock over your ale. Still, using your hands wasn't considered crude. It was normal. Eating with utensils, especially forks, was seen as overly delicate, too fastidious, or even effeminate. There are records of people mocking those who used forks, calling them vain or foreign. In many places, particularly in Northern Europe, forks didn't catch on widely until the 17th century. That's hundreds of years of people thinking, why would I poke my meat with this weird mini spear when I can just grab it like a maniac? The fork did have its defenders, especially in Italy, where it slowly gained popularity in the 14th and 15th centuries. Wealthy households began using 2-pronged versions, still not for every meal, but for certain ones, like pasta. Yes, pasta. Imagine trying to eat long noodles covered in garlic and olive oil using only your fingers and a knife. Things get slippery. The fork finally had a clear advantage. And let's not forget the fringe angle. Some church authorities genuinely believed forks were unnatural. They argued that using them was an insult to God's design. Hands were sacred tools, uniquely human. Replacing them with utensils, especially ones associated with pagan empires, was viewed by some as a form of culinary heresy. Eating with a fork wasn't just weird, it was morally suspicious. After all, who wants to be caught looking like a Byzantine dandy when you could just gnaw politely from a hunk of boar? Meanwhile, other parts of the world had no problem with forks. In Persia, the Middle East, and China, specialized utensils were common, and no one blinked. But Europe, for reasons both theological and practical, took its time. Maybe it was a resistance to change, maybe it was a love of tactile eating, or maybe, just maybe, people really didn't want to wash extra silverware. Spoons, by contrast, got a free pass. People loved them. They were carved from wood, bone, horn, or metal, and often decorated with family symbols or prayers. Some were even worn on belts, ready to scoop at a moment's notice. In fact, the giving of a spoon to a godchild became a tradition, hence the phrase, "born with a silver spoon in your mouth." Not a comment on your eating habits, but on your inheritance status. Knives, too, were ubiquitous, but double-edged ones were discouraged at the table. Too dangerous, too many accidental duels over goose legs. So diners carried single-edged blades, ideal for slicing meat and occasionally proving you weren't the sort of person to eat like an animal. Unless, of course, you wanted to look fierce, then you'd chew straight off the bone and ignore the stares. So when did the fork finally win people over? Slowly, awkwardly, and mostly thanks to the Renaissance obsession with refinement. By the 16th and 17th centuries, as courts became more formal and table manners more rigid, forks started appearing more often, especially among the upper classes. Etiquette books began to recommend them. Dishes became more complex and required precision. Also, powdered wigs and brocade sleeves made finger-eating problematic. You tried dipping your hand in stew while wearing 2 feet of lace. Even then, resistance lingered. In England, forks were a curiosity well into the 1600s. Thomas Coryat, a travel writer, was mocked for praising the fork after visiting Italy. His friends actually nicknamed him Furcifer, meaning fork-bearer. The ridicule was real, but slowly practicality won, and by the 18th century forks had secured their spot at the table. But back here in your medieval moment, you're still the weirdo poking your pie with a tiny trident. People are watching, you feel the judgment, you put the fork down, you tear off a piece with your hand, smear it with sauce and nod. Everyone relaxes. That's better. That's how it's done. Tonight, as you absent-mindedly twirl spaghetti with a fork while scrolling on your phone, remember, that dainty little tool had to fight centuries of suspicion, mockery, and food-flinging fingers to get where it is. You're not just eating, you're participating in a hard-won victory for hygiene and coordination. So give your fork a little nod of thanks, and maybe don't stab your boiled turnip with it in front of a medieval baron. You walk into the great hall expecting grandeur, gold roasted meats, jewelled goblets, and servants fanning noble foreheads with peacock feathers. And sure, some of that's here. There are long wooden tables covered in food, candles flickering in tall iron holders, and the lord of the manor sitting at the high table under a faded tapestry. A roasted peacock propped upright in front of him for dramatic effect. But something's off. The bread is hard, the meat is lukewarm, and that roasted peacock, it looks better than it tastes. Welcome to the royal diet. Extravagant, opulent, and, let's be honest, frequently awful. We tend to imagine that medieval kings and queens dined like fantasy novel characters. Delicate venison, flawless pastries, feasts that lasted for days. And yes, they did eat a lot, and it did last for days. But good food, that's another matter. Royalty ate lavishly, yes, but lavish didn't always mean delicious or nutritious. The menus were long, the portions absurd, and the flavour profiles completely dominated by medieval culinary theory, which unfortunately was less balanced palate and more, let's boil this chicken and dump it in cinnamon. At the heart of this culinary chaos was the concept of the four humours: hot, cold, wet and dry. Everything you ate had to be balanced to match your body's temperament. If you were naturally cold and moist, you might be prescribed hot and dry foods, say roasted lamb with mustard. A royal physician might advise the king to avoid cold fruits or raw vegetables, which were believed to destabilise the body's natural order. So salads, rare, fruit, only cooked. Fresh tomatoes and potatoes didn't exist in Europe yet. Basically, the royal menu was a high-stakes chemistry experiment, with a touch of astrology thrown in for flair. So what did they eat? A lot of meat. Pork, beef, venison, boar, swan, heron and peacock, especially if it looked impressive. Presentation was everything. Dishes were sculpted, dyed with natural pigments and arranged to impress. Imagine a roast pig with a golden apple in its mouth, flanked by pies shaped like castles, and a giant jelly tower jiggling with barely contained ambition. If it looked like it might wobble off the table and file for independence, it was probably a hit. And yet, for all the sparkle, the food itself was often overcooked, over-seasoned, or just weird. Meat was boiled more often than roasted, as boiling was seen as healthier and better for preserving the balance of humours. Sauces were thick with breadcrumbs, vinegar, wine or almond milk, then blasted with cinnamon, cloves and sugar. It was like everything on the table was trying to be dessert, but with a slab of mutton in the middle. Sugar, by the way, was a symbol of wealth. Imported at great expense, it was used not just to sweeten but to flaunt. The rich threw sugar into fish dishes, meat stews, even wine. They didn't care if it made sense, they cared if it screamed expensive. You know what else they loved? Gold. Not in the dishes, on the dishes. Edible gold leaf was used to decorate pastries, fruit, even roast birds. If you weren't eating something that sparkled, were you even nobility? Let's not forget that the food was also cold half the time. Kitchens weren't attached to dining halls. Too much smoke, too many fires, so the food had to be carried in. Depending on how big your estate was, that could mean your dinner took a long, bumpy trip before reaching you. No wonder the sauces were so aggressive. They weren't just for flavour, they were for resuscitation. And then there's the fringe fact for tonight. Jelly eels were once considered a delicacy at royal feasts. Eels were cheap, plentiful, and could be cooked in gelatinous broths that set into trembling semi-transparent towers. A jellied eel centrepiece was both horrifying and deeply fashionable. Like haute cuisine met a science experiment. Despite the culinary chaos, there was some structure. Feasts were organised in courses, not like today's appetizer main dessert system, but in waves of food. Each course might have dozens of dishes, some meat, some sweet, some fish, all laid out at once. You didn't get a plate of your own. You shared trenchers, goblets, and sometimes even napkins. If you were lower ranking at the table, you probably got the leftovers from the high table. And if you were really low ranking, you were serving, not eating. Royal banquets also weren't quiet affairs. Music played. Jugglers juggled. People recited poems, debated theology, or threw turkey legs when the wine kicked in. Food was theatre. It was a power move. It was excess on a scale designed to make you believe the king or queen was divine. because only the divine could afford this many stuffed peacocks and almond milk jellies in one sitting. Scholars have debated how healthy these diets really were. On one hand, the nobility consumed vast quantities of animal protein, sugar and alcohol, often with very few vegetables or fresh fruits. That's a recipe for gout, constipation, and a permanently bad mood. On the other hand, their constant feasting was usually broken by long periods of fasting enforced by the church. 40-day fasts before Easter, meatless Fridays, and vigil days meant that even kings had to dial it back now and then, though they often got creative. Did you know whale counted as fish for fasting purposes? Problem solved! Still, the health consequences were real. Gout was known as the disease of kings. Swollen joints, especially in the feet, were seen as the price of luxury, and poor dental hygiene, combined with constant snacking on honeyed nuts and candied fruit, meant that by age 40 many nobles had a mouth that looked like a chessboard mid-game. So tonight, as you heat up something simple, maybe soup, maybe leftovers, you can smile, knowing that your food is probably hotter, tastier, and less gelatinous than a king's. No mystery sauces, no pie with songbirds baked inside, yes, that was a thing. No risk of catching gout from a single dinner. And if you still want to eat like royalty, sprinkle a little cinnamon on your next steak. Then sit in silence and question every choice you've ever made. You're sitting in a stone-walled dining hall, surrounded by men in robes. The air smells like beeswax candles, old wood and lentils, lots and lots of lentils. The conversation is hushed, serious, and mostly in Latin. You're in a monastery now, which means mealtime is not just about eating. It's about discipline, about cadence, about figuring out exactly how many loopholes it takes to justify eating a roasted beaver during Lent. Because if there's one thing medieval monks were good at, aside from prayer, it was finding delicious ways to follow the rules, or technically follow them. Let's start with the basics. Monastic diets were simple, structured, and, on paper, very restrictive. Most monastic orders followed the rule of St. Benedict, which outlined when and how monks could eat. Meat from four-legged animals was often banned, or at least discouraged. Fasting was frequent. Meals were eaten in silence, with one monk reading aloud from scripture or the writings of early church fathers. The idea was to keep the body humble, the appetite restrained, and the spirit sharp. But medieval monks were not robots. They were human and hungry. Which brings us to the ancient monastic art of the food loophole. No meat? Fine. We'll eat fish. But what counts as fish? Well, eels do. So do seals, puffins, whales, beavers, and basically anything that swims, even if it technically walks or flies too. The logic was beautifully flexible. If it lived in the water, or near the water, it could be blessed, boiled, and served on a Friday. The church eventually had to clarify the rules, but by then, monks were already 3 courses into a seafood banquet featuring animals Noah probably didn't even remember packing. One standout culinary trick? Beaver tail. It's oily, flat, and kind of scale-textured, which made it pass the fish test. Monasteries near rivers became experts at cooking it. Some even included beaver in their fish ponds. Not kidding. Monastic fish ponds were a big deal, carefully managed, often stocked with carp, trout, pike, and anything else that swam. They were like medieval aquaculture farms with spiritual overtones. Feed the soul and the belly, as the saying never went. So the daily monastic schedule revolved around prayer and labour, with meals happening at fixed times. Breakfast, rare. The first main meal came at midday, after a long morning of chanting, copying manuscripts and gardening. Dinner was lighter, eaten in the early evening. Portions were modest, often served in small wooden bowls. A monk's basic meal might include bread, legumes, onions, cheese, and if they were lucky, a few eggs or preserved fish. But not all monasteries were created equal. Wealthier ones, especially in France, England, and the Low Countries, grew enormous estates, produced wine, brewed ale, and had access to incredible food. Some monks lived better than most nobles, especially those in higher offices like abbots or priors. They didn't just eat well, they dined well. Fancy tablecloths, sweetened pastries, and sauces that would have made a court cook jealous. Not exactly the ascetic life, but hey, God moves in mysterious and sometimes buttery ways. Fringe fact, some monastic cookbooks survive. These weren't simple lists of beans and porridge. They contained dozens of elaborate recipes, including desserts made with almond milk, rice, honey and spices, rice pudding, monks were on it, lentil and herb stews, all day. The idea wasn't to indulge, of course, the idea was to make humble ingredients taste heavenly. And if a few extra saffron threads fell into the pot, divine accident. Alcohol was also allowed. In fact, monks were famous for their brewing skills. Ale and beer were safer than water, as we've covered, and monastic breweries produced some of the best drinks in Europe. Monks often received a daily ale allowance, 1 gallon per monk per day in some places. Yes, you heard that right, 1 gallon. Not all of it was alcoholic, mind you, most was small beer, but still. You'd better believe Brother Ethilric was taking his hydration very seriously. Despite all this, fasting was real. During Lent, Advent and specific holy days, food was restricted to the basics: bread, water, vegetables and some fish. No meat, no dairy. In some strict orders, even fish was out, and monks subsisted on plain legumes and broth. It wasn't meant to be fun, it was meant to be humbling, to remind you that spiritual nourishment mattered more than a full belly. But the hunger never stopped clever minds. One 15th century monk reportedly created an entire faux feast out of vegetarian ingredients to trick his fellow friars into thinking they were eating meat. Mushrooms became kidneys. Minced fish was shaped into chicken. It was either genius or sin, depending on who you asked. Probably both. There's a scholarly debate about how closely these dietary rules were followed. Some argue the stricter monasteries really did stick to the rules, eating plain food in silence. Others point to archaeological remains, kitchen tools, animal bones, even wine storage that suggest a livelier reality. In truth, the experience varied dramatically. Some monks fasted and prayed with iron discipline. Others made an entire eel pie and told God it was for spiritual research. So tonight, when you sit down with your bowl of pasta or box of leftovers, think of the monk in his quiet refectory, spooning up lentil stew in solemn melon and meissen, already planning how to convince the abbot that beaver tail counts as fish. There's something both earnest and delightfully human about it all. These weren't hedonists pretending to be holy. They were hungry people trying to do their best under a lot of rules. And if dinner turned into a theological negotiation now and then, well, so be it. Salvation, after all, might just come in the form of a very convincing mushroom. You're not feeling great. There's a strange tightness in your chest, your head's pounding, and your stomach's making noises that sound like a small animal is trapped inside. If you were living in the 21st century, you'd Google it, panic, and end up convinced it's fatal. But you're in the Middle Ages, so instead you do something far more dramatic. You call the local barber. Because in this era, the same guy who trims your beard also pulls your teeth, sets your broken bones, and, if you're really unlucky, drains your blood with surprising enthusiasm. Welcome to medieval medicine, where almost every symptom has one solution. Get the bad stuff out. Feeling sluggish? That's too much black bile. Depressed? Your phlegm's out of balance. Got a weird rash on your arm? That'll be the excess yellow bile, clearly. The body, according to the ancient theory of humours, was governed by 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. All health problems came down to an imbalance among them. Restore balance and you're good to go, in theory, so your local doctor, immersive. And we're using that term very loosely, might diagnose you by examining your urine, your tongue, or your general vibe. Diagnosis complete, he prescribes a round of purging, or bleeding, or both. Bloodletting was one of the go-to treatments, and it was exactly what it sounds like. They cut you open and let you drip. Carefully, of course, they didn't want to kill you, just drain enough to balance out your overachieving fluids. The bleeding wasn't random. Physicians used charts that matched diseases to veins, zodiac signs to body parts, and phases of the moon to treatment windows. Got a headache while the moon's in Aries? Perfect time to bleed the temple. Fever while Mars is ascendant. That'll be the forearm. Medicine was basically astrology with a knife. And if you weren't bleeding, you were purging. Laxatives and emetics were the next best thing. Out is better than in was the unofficial motto of the medieval health industry. Your treatment might involve a strong herbal brew, wormwood, senna, or even aloe to get your bowels moving. Fast. Did it help? Maybe. Or maybe it just gave you additional symptoms for your doctor to treat with more purging, a vicious cycle of evacuation. Then there were the poultices. You'd mash together herbs, breadcrumbs, wine, lard, and whatever else looked vaguely medicinal, then slap it on the problem area. Got a cough? Try a chest plaster of mustard and pig fat. Inflammation? Try onions and honey. It was messy, unpredictable, and deeply pungent. But perhaps no treatment is more classically medieval than leeches. These little slimy friends were a favourite for bloodletting, especially in more delicate areas. Doctors would apply them to the temples, arms, or even more intimate zones, believing that leeches knew where to draw the bad blood. They were expensive too. Some monasteries raised them in special ponds and sold them to towns across Europe. A monk's side hustle, if you will. Here's a fringe detail to ruin your dreams. One 14th century medical text recommended inserting a live weasel into the bed of a woman experiencing difficult childbirth. The logic? The weasel, being symbolically slippery, would help the baby slide out. There is zero evidence this worked, but someone wrote it down, and that means someone probably tried it. Humanity is nothing if not creative under pressure. But not all medieval medicine was terrifying. Some herbal remedies were genuinely effective. Willow bark for pain relief, basically pre-aspirin, peppermint for indigestion, honey for wounds. Monasteries kept detailed herbals, carefully tending medicinal gardens full of sage, yarrow, fennel, and chamomile. And midwives, though often untrained by formal standards, had centuries of collective knowledge about pregnancy, birth, and postpartum care. Their practices were rooted in observation, intuition, and a whole lot of whispered wisdom passed from one woman to another. Hospitals, too, were more about care than cure. Run by religious orders, these were places where the sick, poor, or elderly could rest, pray, and receive food and basic treatment. The goal wasn't necessarily recovery. It was to comfort you while God decided whether you were going to pull through or not. Nurses were often nuns, beds were shared, sanitation was optional, but the intentions were there, and that counts for something. Scholars still debate how effective medieval medicine really was. Some argue that while treatments were based on flawed theories, the act of care, rest, food, touch could have a healing effect in itself. Others point out that without knowledge of bacteria, viruses, or proper sanitation, many treatments did more harm than good. It's a tough call. For every patient who got better with rosemary and honey, there was someone bled into oblivion over a mild fever. And yet people kept seeking help, because no matter how crude or questionable the method, the desire to feel better was universal. Medieval folks weren't stupid. They knew what pain was. They recognized patterns. They observed, experimented, and tried their best with what little they had. They didn't have microscopes, but they had curiosity. And sometimes that was enough to push medicine forward by a few hard-earned inches. So tonight, as you reach for a bottle of ibuprofen or schedule a checkup with a board-certified professional, give a quiet nod to your medieval ancestors. They walked so you could get a flu shot. They bled, literally, so you could get lab tests, antibiotics, and a diagnosis that doesn't involve the moon. And if you ever feel unwell, just be glad no one's reaching for a weasel. You hear them before you see them, boots shuffling down the alley, the clatter of a staff, the faint jingle of something metallic. When the figure steps into the open, children scatter. Shopkeepers close shutters, and even the stray dog backs away. It's not the Black Death itself, but the next best thing, a plague doctor. He's dressed in a long, dark robe, gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, and most famously, that terrifying beaked mask. It looks like something out of a horror movie, or a really avant-garde bird-themed masquerade ball. But in the 14th century, this outfit is serious business. It's medieval PPE, personal plague equipment, and it says, "I'm here to help," probably. The plague doctor wasn't always a doctor in the formal sense. Often, they were hired by towns in a state of panic, desperate to do something. Sometimes they were actual physicians, sometimes just anyone willing to get close to the dying. Either way, they were expected to treat the sick, record deaths, and try not to keel over themselves in the process. The costume? Not for style. It was an early attempt at biohazard protection, based on the best medical theory of the time, miasma. That theory again. Miasma, the belief that diseases were spread through bad air, foul smells, invisible poison floating in the wind. So the long beak on the mask wasn't ornamental, it was functional. Plague doctors stuffed it with sweet-smelling herbs, spices, flowers, and vinegar-soaked rags. Lavender, mint, camphor, rose petals, anything strong enough to cover the stench of decay and hopefully purify the air before it hit their nostrils. Think of it as medieval Febreze shoved into a giant leather nose. The rest of the outfit was equally intentional. Waxed leather or oilcloth garments covered the body head to toe to prevent infection particles from clinging to the skin. Gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat completed the look. The staff served multiple purposes, checking patients without touching them, keeping desperate townsfolk at bay, and probably swatting at rats with grim determination. If nothing else, the whole ensemble created distance, emotional, physical, and spiritual. If you saw the beat coming, you knew death wasn't far behind. But what could the plague doctor actually do? Not much. They might lance buboes, the swollen infected lymph nodes caused by bubonic plague, then apply a poultice of onions, butter, or crushed herbs. Some tried bloodletting, believing it could draw the poison out. Others recommended burning aromatic woods, praying, or applying toads to the sores. No, really, live toads. The theory was that they would suck out the infection. Honestly, the toads probably didn't enjoy it either. And here's a grim little fringe fact. Some plague masks had glass eye openings, which was rare for the time. Eye protection wasn't common, but the designers of these suits figured if the poison could enter through your breath, maybe it could enter through your eyes too. So they added lenses. Were they effective? Probably not, but hey, at least they were committed to the look. The most famous plague outbreak, of course, was the Black Death, which hit Europe in the late 1340s and wiped out somewhere between 30% and 60% of the population. That's not a typo. Whole towns vanished. Families disappeared overnight. Mass graves became standard practice because burying each victim individually became impossible. The sheer speed of the disease was staggering. You could feel fine in the morning and be dead by nightfall. It made everyone paranoid, terrified, and extremely unhygienic. Fear led to desperation, and desperation led to blame. Jews were accused of poisoning wells and were murdered in horrific pogroms. Foreigners, beggars, lepers, and even cats were targeted as scapegoats. Yes, cats. Many were killed during the plague, which ironically helped rats thrive. Rats carried fleas, fleas carried the plague bacterium. Killing cats? Not the best strategy. Medieval logic strikes again. But despite all this, some cities did try real preventative measures. Quarantines were established. Ships coming into ports like Venice were required to wait 40 days offshore. Quarantagioni, hence the word quarantine. Travellers were turned away, and some towns posted guards at the gates to prevent outsiders from entering. They didn't understand germs, but they did understand patterns. Sick people coming into town is equals town gets sick. Block the sick people, simple math. Plague, doctors became symbols, not just of medicine, but of the surreal, nightmarish landscape people lived in. They were both feared and needed. Villagers didn't trust them, but they didn't want to face death alone either. Some doctors took bribes to treat wealthy families. Others abandoned their posts and fled. A few wrote detailed accounts of what they saw, which is how we know the horrors weren't exaggerated. Scholars debate how common the full-beat costume really was. The iconic image comes from a French physician named Charles Delorme, who described the outfit in the 17th century during a later outbreak. There's little evidence it was worn widely during the original Black Death in the 1340s, but whether it was real or symbolic, the mask has become inseparable from plague imagery. A bird-faced grim reaper waddling down the alley with a bouquet of mint jammed into its beak. Modern historians look back on plague doctors with a mix of horror and sympathy. Their treatments were mostly useless, their understanding was flawed, but their willingness to walk into death zones with little more than some herbs and hope, that takes a certain kind of courage, or desperation, or both. So tonight, as you glance at your digital thermometer, scroll through health blogs, or casually text your doctor with a mild concern, remember what it once meant to be treated. To open your door and find a leather-clad birdman holding a stick ready to bleed you in the name of balance and block out the smell of your suffering with a handful of lavender. And if that doesn't make you thankful for urgent care, I don't know what will. You've got the toothache again, same spot, same throbbing, same sinking feeling in your gut. You know exactly what's coming. It isn't modern dentistry, it isn't even a mildly effective herbal rinse. No, this time someone leans in with a solemn expression and says the words you've been dreading. Toothworm. That's right, according to medieval medical theory, the pain in your mouth isn't from cavities, abscesses, or infection. It's from a tiny worm burrowing into your tooth and squirming around in there like it owns the place. Welcome to the bizarre world of medieval medical folklore, where every pain had a creature, Every illness had a spirit, and no body part was safe from myth. Toothworms were widely accepted across Europe and the Islamic world for centuries. The idea probably came from the fact that if you cracked open a rotting tooth, you might see soft, stringy pulp inside, looking suspiciously worm-like. Add in a bit of pain-fueled imagination and a dash of poetic storytelling, and voila, squirmy invader confirmed. People truly believed the worm bored into the tooth, causing pain when it moved, and blessed relief when it rested, which makes toothache sound a lot like a really bad roommate situation. So what did they do about it? You'd think they'd go in with tongs and yank the whole thing out, which they sometimes did, but first, they tried to coax the worm out. Seriously. Early remedies included smoking the tooth with burning herbs or incense, hoping the worm would find the smell unpleasant and crawl out. In Norway, one remedy involved boiling henbane and having the patient breathe in the steam while plugging the opposite ear. Why? Apparently the worm would be smoked out of the skull like a reluctant tenant. You can almost picture it, can't you? A desperate man clutching his jaw while someone waves a smouldering bundle of herbs under his face, both of them waiting in awkward silence for the worm to evacuate. And it wasn't just teeth. Medieval medicine was full of creatures. Liver pain, possibly caused by toads, stomach issues, you might have a snake curled up inside, a headache, a demon of course. What else could explain something that unpleasant? The line between physical and spiritual was incredibly blurry. Illness was never just a biological problem, it was a sign, a punishment, a possession, a test, sometimes all four. That's why magical cures were as common as medical ones. You might be prescribed a charm to wear around your neck inscribed with protective phrases or astrological symbols, or you might be told to recite a prayer while holding a relic, preferably one connected to a healing saint. Saint Apollonia, for example, was the go-to figure for dental pain. Why? Because she'd had all her teeth torn out during her martyrdom. You prayed to her, hoping she'd take pity on you and perhaps yank your own pain out with divine force. Fringe fact of the night. In some regions, people believed that carrying a dried frog in a small bag around your neck could cure a toothache. Others claimed that if you spat into a frog's mouth and set it free, it would take the pain with it. It's unclear whether this worked or just gave you a new fear of amphibians. This crossover between folklore and medicine also shows up in treatments involving astrology. You weren't supposed to have a tooth pulled when the moon was in Taurus, because Taurus rules the neck and mouth. Better wait for a safer sign, like Sagittarius or Libra. Some medical guides included entire charts to help patients schedule their surgeries according to the stars. Imagine telling your dentist today, "Sorry, we'll have to reschedule. Mars is in retrograde and I don't want my gums to bleed excessively." And while we laugh at toothworms and star charts now, we forget that medieval people were doing the best they could. Pain with no explanation is terrifying. No microscopes, no anesthesia, no idea what a bacteria was, just relentless aching in your skull and a handful of guesses. So if someone said, "It's a worm," you nodded. Because honestly, that explanation was better than nothing. Of course, sometimes things worked. Some herbal remedies genuinely reduced pain. Clove oil, for instance, has mild anesthetic properties, and certain poultices had anti-inflammatory effects, but most of it was trial and error, passed down by word of mouth or scribbled into messy manuscripts stored in monasteries. Medical texts from the time often included both scientific advice and straight-up magical spells side by side, with no clear boundary between the two. If one didn't work, you tried the other. Scholars still argue about the influence of superstition on medieval health practices. Was it just for the poor and uneducated? Or did even trained physicians believe in worms and spirits? Evidence suggests that even the most scholarly doctors included folk beliefs in their routines. After all, they were part of the same cultural soup. Belief wasn't something you set aside, it was woven into how you interpreted pain, disease, and healing. So tonight, when your mouth is sore from eating too many chips, or that one molar starts acting up because you forgot to floss again, pause for a moment, feel the ache. Now imagine explaining it to someone in the 1300s. It's probably just a cavity, you say. They nod solemnly, pull out a steaming bundle of herbs, and begin chanting in Latin while eyeing your jaw like a battlefield. We don't believe in toothworms anymore. But once upon a time, people thought your pain had a shape, a presence, a wriggling life of its own, and that's strangely poetic. Terrifying, but poetic. And now, maybe, just maybe, your jaw starts to feel a little sore, doesn't it? You're sitting cross-legged by the fire, absently scratching the back of your neck. Nothing unusual, Everyone does it. Then someone else reaches into their tunic and starts combing through their hair with 2 fingers, pinching and flicking. You hear a faint snap. Another one bites the dust. Welcome to the eternal medieval pastime, the lice battle. Not a day goes by without someone doing the slow, deliberate ritual of the scratch check squish. It's not just hygiene, it's bonding. A community activity, weirdly soothing if you don't think too hard about the fact that your scalp is a 5-star buffet for parasitic hitchhikers. Lice were everywhere in the Middle Ages. Head lice, body lice, even pubic lice, which had their own set of awkward challenges. No one was immune. Nobles had them. Peasants definitely had them. Monks had entire cloisters devoted to keeping their robes clean, which basically meant less filthy. The only group that really came close to escaping was the totally bald. But even then, you'd better check your eyebrows. People accepted lice as a fact of life like rain or taxes. You slept in wool, wore layers year-round, and rarely washed your underclothes. All of it was prime real estate for bugs. There were even special lice combs, fine-toothed tools used to drag the little pests from your hair. Some were carved from bone or ivory, and a few still survive in museum collections today, tiny teeth worn smooth from daily use. Finding lice wasn't shameful, it was routine. You might even sit with a friend or family member in the evening, picking through each other's hair by candlelight while trading gossip. Cozy, right? Here's a lovely fringe detail. Some people believed lice were a natural part of the body's heat escaping. Like steam from a pot. You got hot, your humours got agitated, and lice just appeared. Others said they were a punishment from God for pride, laziness, or gluttony, which is a bit rude considering that even the humblest beggar was often scratching away with the rest of them. There were remedies, of course, some more effective than others. People tried washing their hair with vinegar, rubbing in crushed herbs like pennyroyal or lavender, or combing with mixtures of oil and ashes. These didn't kill the lice outright, but they might stun them long enough to do some manual removal. You could also wrap your head in a cloth soaked in strong-smelling concoctions, which mostly worked by making you smell so terrible that even the lice reconsidered their life choices. In larger households and monasteries, washing days were organised partly to control the lice problem. Garments were boiled or beaten clean at riversides, then hung to dry in the sun. Heat helped, but it wasn't a perfect solution. Lice eggs, nits, stuck stubbornly to fibres, especially wool, and could still survive for weeks. If you didn't catch every last one, the infestation was back before you finished your next psalm. And of course, there was the social etiquette around it. You didn't just reach over and start picking through someone's hair in public unless you were close, like really close. But among family members or lovers, it was almost intimate, a sign of care, of attention. Some medieval love poems even mention louse picking as a tender act. Let me find the little beasts in your hair is, apparently, the ancient equivalent of I'd hold your hand in public. Body lice were even worse. They lived in the seams of clothing and feasted while you slept. Most people only owned 1 or 2 outfits, and those were rarely washed, so lice made themselves right at home. Changing your clothes meant moving them from one set of seams to another. The best hope was to rotate garments and beat them with a stick outside in the cold. Did it work? Not especially, but at least it gave the lice a little cardio. What about the rich? Surely royalty had better hygiene, sort of. While they had access to better clothes and bathing facilities, they also wore heavy layers, perfumed but not always clean. Their beds were massive but shared with attendants, pets and other warm-breathing creatures. That's a 5-course feast for a determined louse. You think your royal canopy is elegant until you realise it's also a highway system for tiny biting insects. Some monks took vows of poverty that included giving up regular laundering, believing that enduring lice was a kind of holy suffering. One saint was even praised for never scratching his itches, viewing the bites as divine trials. Another reportedly thanked his lice for reminding him of his sinfulness. There's piety, and then there's thank you, itchy free, for chewing on me in the name of salvation. Scholars still debate how seriously people took lice infestations. Some sources suggest a resigned attitude, just part of life. Others indicate efforts to control or reduce them, especially in military camps or cities during outbreaks. After all, body lice also spread disease. The bacteria that causes typhus, for example, was transmitted by lice. So when conditions got really bad, lice weren't just annoying, they were deadly. And yet for all that, people found ways to laugh about it. Lice appear in medieval jokes, riddles, and even plays. They were a common punchline, part nuisance, part comedy, part mirror of everyday life. After all, if everyone's scratching, you might as well laugh about it. So tonight, as you lay your head on a fresh pillowcase, clean hair tucked under a blanket, no comb in sight, just know you're living in the golden age of personal hygiene. No itch you can't fix. No tiny invaders making a home in your sleeves. You don't need a friend to check behind your ears for stowaways. You've got shampoo, hot water, privacy. And if your head does itch suddenly, it's probably just psychosomatic. Probably. It's late. The fire's burned down to embers, and the only light in your one-room cottage comes from the flickering red glow on the hearth. You've already stuffed some straw into the gaps between the shutters to keep the wind from howling too loud, and now you're lying down, not in a bed as you know it, but on a rough mattress made of straw or rags, sometimes filled with dried heather, sometimes just old clothing and luck. It's not comfortable, but you're used to it. And as you pull a coarse blanket over your shoulders and roll toward your snoring uncle and two cousins, you're reminded that sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't just different. It was layered, literally and figuratively. First things first, people didn't sleep alone. Most medieval folks shared their sleeping space. Families huddled together, siblings spooned like logs, and sometimes even strangers on the road were invited to curl up near the fire for the night. Privacy was a luxury no one really expected. And warmth, that was a team effort. You didn't argue about blanket hogging when your breath was fogging up in the dark and the wind was threatening to turn your toes into medieval popsicles. Even in wealthier homes, beds were shared. Servants might sleep at the foot of their master's bed. Children bunked with parents. Guests doubled up if the household was full. A feather mattress was a sign of wealth, but most people used straw-stuffed sacks, sometimes with a layer of animal skin on top for softness or warmth, or at least for some protection against the things crawling inside the mattress, which we're not going to talk about just yet. Now here's something you might not know. People in the Middle Ages often slept in 2 shifts. The idea of one solid 8-hour block of sleep is a relatively modern invention. Back then, first sleep began not long after sunset. People would drift off for a few hours, then wake up sometime around midnight. They'd stay awake for an hour or two, praying, tending the fire, chatting quietly, even visiting neighbours or engaging in what some very old texts delicately call marital obligations. Then came second sleep, another few hours of rest before morning chores began. This segmented sleep pattern actually makes a lot of sense in a pre-electricity world. Night wasn't just something to endure, it was a natural rhythm, broken into useful parts. Waking up in the middle of the night wasn't a problem, it was expected. Some monks even built their entire routines around this idea, rising at specific hours to pray or chant in candlelit chapels while the rest of the world lay in slumber. The bedroom itself, if you were lucky enough to have one, wasn't much of a sanctuary. Drafty, cold, and usually serving multiple purposes, it was less sleep temple and more everything room with a bed in it. For most people, the kitchen, bedroom, and living space were all one room. You might have your goat in the corner, the chamber pot near your feet, and someone's boots dangling a little too close to your face. And speaking of the chamber pot, yes, you used one if you were indoors, or if the need struck while you were outside, a handy bush would do. Most chamber pots were emptied into the street in the morning, sometimes with a warning shout, sometimes with none at all. That's why walking under windows in the early hours was risky business. Not a time to dawdle. Your bedding was basic. A wool blanket if you had one. If not, you layered. Old cloaks, furs. If you were poor, maybe just a pile of straw. Some families made do with sacks of straw hung from ropes like hammocks, which sounds charming, until you imagine trying to sleep in one with a dog and a toddler rolling around at your feet. The fire was your only heat source, so you'd bank it carefully before bed, hoping the coals would last until morning. You might even put a hot stone at the foot of the bed, wrapped in cloth, to warm your feet. It wasn't luxurious, but it was practical. Everyone knew the cold could kill, literally. In winter, the difference between a toasty ember and a dead fire might be the difference between waking up groggy or not waking up at all. One fringe fact to warm your soul: some medieval inns offered straw sleep for travellers too poor to rent a bed. You'd pay a few coins and be allowed to sleep on the floor near the hearth with a pile of fresh-ish straw, no pillow, no privacy, just warmth, shelter, and maybe a chicken or two stepping on your head during the night. Interestingly, pillows weren't as common as you'd think. They were considered indulgent by some, especially among ascetic monks and lower-class folks. If you used one, it was often just a folded cloak or a bundle of cloth. Feather-stuffed pillows existed, but they were a luxury. And if you've ever slept on a sack of barley, you'll understand why people woke up cranky and stiff, especially when sharing space with 6 other human furnaces and a dog named Balthazar. So tonight, as you tuck into your memory foam mattress with its hypoallergenic cover and neatly folded throw blanket, spare a thought for your medieval counterpart. They're curled beside a smoky hearth, wrapped in someone's old tunic, dreaming between shifts and hoping the fire doesn't go out before dawn. Sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't perfect, but it was practical, it was shared, and it was often the only truly peaceful part of the day. Assuming no one rolled over and stole your only blanket halfway through your second sleep, is freezing. Not the kind of freezing that makes you bundle up for a quick trip to the store. No, this is medieval freezing. The kind that seeps through your floorboards, creeps under the door, and climbs into your bones with zero intention of leaving. You're curled up in bed fully clothed, wearing 2 tunics, wool socks, a hood, and maybe even your boots if you're particularly committed to survival. And yet your toes still feel like someone dipped them in icy water and forgot to fish them out. Welcome to the cold bed problem, a nightly ritual of creative suffering in the Middle Ages. Castles and cottages alike were draughty, damp, and notoriously hard to heat. Stone walls held onto the chill, wooden floors were often just planks over open air. That romantic 4-poster bed, a wind tunnel with curtains. Even in summer, nights could be biting, especially in northern Europe. The hearth was the only reliable source of warmth, and once the fire died down for the night, so did your chances of sleeping in comfort. Unless, of course, you came prepared. One of the most ingenious solutions? The bed warmer. Not the person sleeping next to you, though they helped, but an actual device. A metal pan with a long handle, filled with hot coals, and slid between the sheets just before bed. It warmed the fabric, toasted the mattress a little, and made climbing into bed slightly less horrifying. Of course, there was a catch. If you left it in too long or got distracted, congratulations, you'd now be sleeping on lightly scorched straw. More than one medieval mattress met its end this way. For those without access to coals or fancy bedpans, there were hot stones. Heated by the fire and wrapped in cloth, they were placed at the foot of the bed to keep your toes from freezing off. Some folks used bricks instead. Anything that could hold a little heat. In wealthier homes, there were footstoves, wooden boxes with hot embers inside, slipped under benches or beds. These were portable and relatively safe, though you'd still wake up with a face full of smoke if ventilation wasn't perfect, which it rarely was. Let's not forget the humble feather bed. If you had money or lived in a well-stocked monastery, you might sleep on a thick mattress filled with feathers or down. These retained warmth better than straw or wool, and when combined with layers of heavy blankets and a fur coverlet, they made winter nights bearable. For everyone else, it was about layering. Wool on wool on wool, blankets, cloaks, rags, anything that held heat and didn't smell too offensive. A fringe fact that's equal parts weird and adorable. Some medieval households kept pigs or goats inside during the coldest months, not just for protection, but also for warmth. In small cottages, the animals were brought in at night and bedded down near the fire. Their body heat helped warm the room, and no one complained. A pig might smell like, well, a pig, but when it's 0 degrees outside, you're not picky. Children and elderly people were particularly vulnerable, and some families went to great lengths to keep them warm. Extra blankets, warming stones, placing beds closer to the fire, even letting the kids sleep in the same bed as the parents and the baby and the dog. It wasn't comfortable, but it was warmer than the alternative. Cold killed. And everyone knew it. Of course, wealthier families had options, heavy tapestries on the walls, thick drapes around the bed, stone fireplaces in each room if you were really fancy. But even then it was a constant battle. You could go to bed warm and wake up with your breath clouding in the air, frost creeping along the windows, and icicle dew-pools forming from the ceiling beams. That's not exaggeration. It happened. Especially in uninsulated towers and large halls where the fire couldn't reach every corner, and just because you were cold didn't mean you could sleep in late. The day started early. Whether you were a servant, a farmer, or a novice monk, dawn meant chores, so you rolled out of bed with numb fingers and stiff knees, pulled on a damp cloak, and shuffled toward the fire. Assuming it was still lit. If not, your first task was to coax a flame from a few stubborn embers and pretend your teeth weren't chattering loud enough to scare the cat. Scholars today still debate how people coped with this level of discomfort. Some suggest that people simply had different expectations, less about comfort, more about endurance. Others point to layered clothing and bed sharing as functional strategies that were normalized to the point of invisibility. A few argue that cold was actually seen as virtuous, especially among ascetics and monks, suffering for the soul and all that. There's even writing from medieval mystics who describe the cold as a divine gift, proof of bodily humility. But back in the real world, cold was a problem to be solved, not romanticized. Medieval people didn't embrace it. They fought it day and night, with every blanket, fire, and warm body they could find. If you couldn't afford wood, you burned dung. If you couldn't afford dung, you burned old rags or chopped up furniture. Some households gathered in the kitchen at night, not to cook, but to sleep huddled on the warmest floor in the house close to the dying hearth. So tonight, as you slip into a bed that's just the right temperature, tucked under blankets that have never caught fire, and pillows that have never shared space with a goat, take a moment to be grateful. No warming pan needed, no hot brick rolled into a towel, no bitter gust slicing through a cracked shutter. Just warmth, quiet, comfort, and the peace of knowing you won't wake up with your socks frozen to your feet. You glance out the narrow window slit as snow falls steadily across the courtyard, and for a moment you admire the silence of winter. Then you remember you have to go outside, to the market, to the field, to anywhere, wearing what amounts to several heavy rugs, a prayer and boots made from dreams and damp leather. Welcome to the ongoing medieval fashion dilemma. Looking good might get you noticed, but dressing for survival, that's for the weak. And so begins the great war between frostbite and fashion. Let's be clear, clothing in the Middle Ages was not designed for comfort, insulation, or practicality. It was designed for status, for showing off, for identifying who you were, what you did, and how much better, or worse, your family was than everyone else. And as for staying warm, that was sort of optional, or more accurately, your layers were your only hope. Peasants dressed for utility. They wore tunics of coarse wool, often undyed and scratchy over a basic linen shift. Trousers or hose covered the legs, tied with cords or bits of scrap fabric. On their feet, worn leather shoes, sometimes stuffed with straw for warmth, and patched so many times they were mostly patches. Over everything, a cloak or mantle, water-resistant if they were lucky, slightly mouldy if they weren't. Hoods were essential, gloves a luxury. You might use the sleeves of your tunic instead, pulling them down like makeshift mittens and hoping for the best. Meanwhile, up the social ladder, fashion got complicated. Nobles layered multiple tunics, often in bright colours and expensive fabrics, dyed wool, silk if they could afford it, or fur-lined cloaks that looked glamorous but didn't always cover much. Sleeves were huge, cloaks were cut for drama. Some of the more fashionable outfits had open sides or dangling bits of fabric that caught on everything. And let's not forget those absurd pointy shoes, poulaines, with toes so long they had to be tied to your knee to stop you from tripping. They looked magnificent. They also let in snow. Women had it even worse. Gowns often trailed behind them, dragging through mud and slush. Bodices were tight, sleeves elaborate, and hoods heavy. Some hats were so large or starched they acted like satellite dishes, collecting snow and blowing off in the wind. But did that stop anyone? No, because looking rich was more important than staying warm. Fashion said, I don't need to dress for the weather, I have people for that. Spoiler, they usually didn't. Here's a fringe fact. In the 14th century, laws were passed in parts of Europe limiting who could wear certain materials or colours. These sumptuary laws were meant to prevent people from dressing above their station. Purple was often reserved for royalty. Fur trims were restricted to the wealthy. If a peasant dared wear imported cloth, they could be fined, or worse. Not because it was offensive, but because it blurred social lines. Fashion, you see, wasn't just about expression, it was about control. But fashion had other consequences too. Cold-related illnesses were common, especially among those who chose silk over wool in the middle of January. The young and stylish froze, literally. There are records of people catching frost fever after attending winter festivals in fashion-forward clothing, with open sleeves and thin slippers. Because nothing says nobility like getting frostbite from dancing in velvet shoes during a snowstorm. So how did people stay warm under all that nonsense? Layering, mostly. Undergarments, overgarments, cloaks, wraps, and hats. Wool was the primary defence, but fur came into play when it could be afforded. Squirrel, rabbit, and even cat fur were used to line garments, though the latter was often kept quiet. No one wanted to admit their collar came from fluffy. Linings were sometimes detachable, so garments could be swapped seasonally, but again warmth was a side effect. Fashion was the main event. You might assume people stayed indoors during the coldest months, but that wasn't always possible. Markets, pilgrimages, festivals, and religious obligations didn't stop for snow. So people bundled up, braved the weather, and walked carefully to avoid slipping on ice in shoes that had no traction whatsoever. Cobbled streets were treacherous, so were frozen mud paths. Broken bones weren't just bad luck, they were a seasonal trend. Some households did adapt creatively. Heated stones tucked into cloaks, footstools filled with embers at mass. Hand warmers, small metal pots with coals inside, held during long winter sermons. The wealthy even used fur-lined hand muffs, which served both warmth and flirtation. Sharing a muff with someone was a real power move, romantic and draft-proof. Still, there was a clear divide between dressing to survive and dressing to impress. Scholars debate how much this balance affected people's daily choices. Some argue that the poor had little say. They wore what they could, patched and repurposed. Others note that even peasants invested in best outfits for feast days, weddings, or church. A good cloak might be your most valuable possession, handed down for generations. Looking nice, just once in a while, was worth a little cold. So tonight, when you pull on fleece pyjamas, wrap yourself in a hoodie, or adjust the thermostat from your phone, remember your medieval counterparts. They're trudging through the snow in shoes that leak, wearing 5 layers of wool and trying not to catch fire from the candle they've tucked into their mitt. They're fashionable, they're freezing, and they're absolutely not giving up those pointy shoes. You're standing in a field under a grey sky, wrapped in chainmail, sweating in places you didn't know could sweat, and already regretting everything. You haven't fought anyone yet, just walked from the village to the training ground, but your tunic is clinging to you, your padded gambesons soaked, and you can smell yourself through the layers. Welcome to chivalry's dirty little secret. Knights might have looked glorious from a distance, but up close they were basically walking sausages of damp wool, scorched leather, and very questionable hygiene. Armour looks cool in movies, gleaming plate, noble crests, and the soft jingle of spurs. But wearing it, a full-time nightmare. It wasn't just heavy, it was hot. Underneath the plate or chainmail, knights wore padded undergarments called gambesons. These were thick quilted jackets meant to prevent bruises and reduce chafing. They were also sweat magnets. Imagine strapping 3 mattresses to your body, then putting on a metal oven and running around in it for hours. Congratulations, you're halfway to knowing what it felt like. And don't forget, bathing was irregular, laundry even more so. Your gambeson, stuffed with a horsehair or wool, absorbed every drop of sweat, every splash of spilled ale, every crushed bit of battlefield stew. After a few weeks on campaign, it smelled like it could qualify as its own soldier. Drying it out was hard, cleaning it was harder. Replacing it was expensive. So you just kept wearing it day after day until the odour became part of your aura. Then came the armour itself, hundreds of metal rings for chainmail or interlocking plates for late medieval suits. Chainmail shirts alone could weigh up to 30 pounds. Plate armour closer to 45 to 60. But the real issue wasn't just the weight. It was how close it sat to your body. With no airflow, heat built up fast. Nights would overheat even in cold weather. Under the summer sun, you were basically a roasted chicken inside a steel toaster. Here's a delightful fringe fact. Some knights had their squires pour wine or vinegar into their armour during breaks just to cool them off, or to at least freshen things up a little. Whether it worked is debatable, but it did make you smell like a walking salad. Of course, armour wasn't something you put on alone. You needed help. Usually a squire or servant to buckle the straps, adjust the plates and make sure everything was tight but not fatal. Getting into full armour could take 10 to 20 minutes with assistance. Getting out of it took just as long, unless you collapsed in a sweaty heap and begged someone to peel it off like an onion. And that's just preparation. Imagine wearing that armour all day. You'd march in it, ride in it, maybe even sleep in it if the camp was unsafe. Your body would chafe in places you couldn't reach. You would get pressure sores, bruises, blisters. If you fell off your horse in battle, good luck getting up again before someone ran a sword through the eye slot in your helmet. Chivalry was beautiful in theory, but it was less about honour and more about pain tolerance. Let's talk about helmets. They were essential, yes, but they were also stuffy, echoey, and sometimes obstructed your vision to the point of being dangerous. Breathing through a visor during combat meant hot air, stale sweat, and occasional moments of claustrophobic panic. Some helmets had padded interiors, but many just had leather straps. And if you wore a coif, a tight hood of mail or cloth underneath, you could feel your brain slowly poaching. Knights did carry small cloths or armpit towels to wipe themselves down during rest. But the concept of hygiene was loose. Washing wasn't a priority on campaign. You might go weeks without a proper bath. Drinking water was scarce. LA was more common. The result? Dehydrated, overheated, half-drunk knights with BO that could probably qualify as chemical warfare. And yet armour was status. The shinier, the better. Knights polished their gear obsessively, not just to prevent rust, but to show off wealth and prestige. Some armour was even gilded or etched with intricate patterns. Function and fashion collided, because if you were going to die in a field somewhere, you might as well look impressive doing it. What about women? They didn't wear armour in battle generally, but noble women riding long distances wore layers of stiff wool and fur, often under heavy cloaks. Not exactly breathable. Long sleeves dragged through mud. Petticoats clung with sweat. It was hard to look dignified while trying to scrape horse droppings off your hem with a twig. Still, fashion demanded it. There's a scholarly debate about whether medieval people even noticed the stink. Did they become nose-blind or did they actively work to mask it? Probably both. Knights sometimes carried sachets of herbs tucked into their clothing, and a few courtly manuals recommend airing out garments and wiping down after battle. But honestly, most people were too exhausted to care, and bathing was risky. Knights rarely stripped down completely, especially in the public bathhouses. Vulnerability wasn't just physical, it was social. Instead, they might get a dry wash with a damp cloth or dab perfumed water on their face and neck. Was it enough? Not remotely, but it was something. So tonight, as you slip into clean pyjamas, maybe after a hot shower and a little spritz of deodorant, imagine climbing into bed after 10 hours in a steel shell soaked with sweat, mud, horsehair, and battlefield funk. Imagine peeling off a gambeson that stands upright on its own. Imagine the relief. And then, imagine having to do it all over again tomorrow. Chivalry wasn't dead, it just smelled really, really bad. You're minding your own business, trying to sell onions at the market, or maybe care to just enjoy your very dry bread in peace, when suddenly there's a commotion. A crowd gathers near the town square. Someone's being dragged by the elbow, pushed onto a wooden platform and forced to sit on a narrow bench with their arms clamped into a wooden frame. Ah yes, it's that time again. Public punishment o'clock. And tonight's entertainment, a local woman accused of gossiping too loudly. Her sentence, the scold's bridle, because nothing says justice quite like strapping metal around someone's head and inviting the entire town to stare. The Middle Ages didn't just do punishment, they performed it. Justice wasn't tucked away in courtrooms or handled quietly behind closed doors. It happened in public, with maximum spectacle and minimal dignity. Stocks, pillories, ducking stools, scarlet letters, branded palms. These weren't just tools of correction, they were theatre. The idea was to shame the wrongdoer so thoroughly that they'd never even think of jaywalking again, or gossiping, or stealing a chicken, or wearing purple silk when they clearly didn't have the tax receipts to justify it. Let's talk stocks and pillories first. They're often confused, but they were different devices, each with their own specific humiliation settings. Stocks locked your ankles into wooden boards, leaving you seated and vulnerable, usually for hours, sometimes days. Pillories locked your head and hands, forcing you to stand uncomfortably and look ridiculous while townspeople laughed, jeered, and occasionally threw whatever was nearby, rotten food, mud, manure, dead rodents, you name it. Honestly, a medieval town square wasn't complete without someone trapped in one of these contraptions, silently re-evaluating all their life choices. Now, here's your fringe detail of the night. In some towns, people wore punishment hats, literal dunce caps, animal masks, or elaborate headgear indicating the specific crime. If you cheated at dice, you might be forced to wear a carved die on your head while being paraded around. If you were caught lying, your hat might include giant fake ears. Think of it as early meme culture, but deeply personal, and with way more poultry guts involved. Punishment wasn't just for theft or violence, it was for bad manners, bad timing, or just being annoying. The scold's bridle, also called the brank, was a metal cage fitted over a woman's head, often with a small plate that pressed against the tongue to prevent speech, Accused of nagging, gossiping, or challenging authority, into the bridle you went. It was equal parts silencing device and public humiliation helmet, designed to make the wearer look absurd and silent. But why so theatrical? Because in a world without modern policing, deterrence was everything. Public punishment served as a lesson to everyone watching. Look at that guy in the stocks with the duck tied to his head. Do you want to end up like him? No. Then behave. Fear was a communal tool, and the more ridiculous the punishment, the more memorable the lesson. There were also ducking stools, used mostly for women accused of being quarrelsome or suspected of witchcraft. The accused was strapped to a chair attached to a long wooden beam and repeatedly dunked into a river or pond. The idea was to shock, frighten and humiliate, not necessarily to drown, though that did happen, because medieval safety protocols were exactly as terrible as you imagine. A short rope plus a heavy chair and an unpredictable crowd. Not a great combination. And it wasn't just the punishment, it was the announcement. Town criers yelled out the charges, someone beat a drum, sometimes the town bell was rung, the crowd gathered, not just to watch, but to participate. Throwing things, shouting insults, spitting, your average bystander became part of the correctional system. Justice was interactive. The punishments varied wildly by region too. In France, you might be shaved bald and paraded through town. In Germany, you might be made to crawl through the streets while people whipped you with nettles. In England, you could be tied to a cart and dragged from one parish to another, like a particularly unpleasant parade float. It was customised cruelty. There's a scholarly debate about whether these punishments were effective or just theatrical nonsense. Some argue that public shaming had a strong deterrent effect in tight-knit communities. Others say it bred resentment and social division. What's clear is that these punishments were visible. There was no hiding. No one quietly paid a fine and moved on. You wore your mistake, sometimes literally. And it wasn't just about punishment, it was about reputation. In a world where social standing was everything, being seen in the stocks could ruin your chances of marriage, employment, or even basic respect. A noble in the stocks, a scandal, a priest in the bridle, a crisis, a miller with fake donkey ears. Well, he did overcharge for flour last week, didn't he? Of course, not everyone saw these acts as justice. Some victims were wrongly accused, targeted for political reasons, or just unlucky. A woman with strong opinions, a traveller who didn't know the local customs, a teenager who insulted the wrong merchant's hat. For every rightful punishment, there was likely an unfair one, but the crowd rarely cared. Public punishment wasn't about fairness, it was about performance. So tonight, as you scroll past someone's awkward social media post or read a heated comment thread, remember, public shaming isn't new. It just used to involve wooden devices, bruised apples, and your neighbours screaming shame until their voices cracked. And if you ever feel embarrassed about something you did today, just be glad no one tied you to a stool and dipped you in a river while playing the lute. You walk into the tavern, the door creaking on swollen wooden hinges, and you're immediately hit by the smell. A bouquet of smoke, sweat, stale beer, wet dog, and something faintly resembling pickled onions, but angrier. The air is thick with warmth and noise. Boots stamp the rush-covered floor, mugs clink, and someone in the back is trying badly to play a lute. Welcome to your local medieval pub, equal parts chaos, comfort, and communicable disease. It's not glamorous, but it's home. For a few hours, anyway. Taverns, inns and alehouses were the beating heart of social life for much of medieval Europe. They weren't just about getting drunk, although yes, that happened a lot. They were places to meet, talk, eat, deal, argue, and sometimes sleep, but only if you were desperate or poor enough to call a bench a bed. If you were a peasant with a little coin or a merchant passing through, this was your gathering space, your rumour mill, your dining room, and occasionally your boxing ring. The drink of choice was ale, not just because it was tasty, but because it was safer than water. Clean drinking water wasn't exactly abundant, especially in crowded towns, so people drank ale even for breakfast. It was low in alcohol, small ale, as it was called, and even children drank it. Stronger brews existed for special occasions or heavier evenings, but if you were at the tavern during the day, odds are you were sipping something only slightly boozier than a modern kombucha. Meals, if available, were simple. Thick pottage, bread that could chip a tooth, maybe some salted fish or cheese if you were lucky. In larger towns, some taverns had cooking pots simmering all day. You'd buy a ladle full of whatever was inside, cabbage stew, onion broth, or the medieval classic, mystery meat. If you were rich, maybe you got a chunk of roast from the spit. If you weren't, well, there's always another bowl of barley mush. And let's not forget the rushes. Most tavern floors were covered in rushes, dried plants, herbs and straw, supposedly to soak up spills and keep things clean. Spoiler, they didn't. Over time, those rushes got matted down with beer, sweat, bits of food, mud, blood, and worse. Some inns changed them regularly, most didn't. You weren't just walking on a floor, you were squishing through a low-effort compost pile. So maybe keep your shoes on, and don't drop your meat pie. Here's a fringe fact to stir your drink with. In some cities, taverns were required by a law to hang a recognisable sign outside so even illiterate travellers could identify them. That's how we ended up with names like the Boar's Head, or the Crown and Goose. No GPS needed, just look for the painted animal swinging in the wind and follow your nose. Entertainment, that varied. A bard might sing a tale of some overly dramatic night. A juggler might work the room for coins. Dice and card games were popular, though often frowned upon by local authorities, read heavily fined if you won too much. Drinking songs were basically mandatory, and if things got rowdy, which they often did, someone might end up being chased out with a stool leg or tossed into the mud for saying the wrong thing about someone's daughter. Inns served a slightly more practical role than taverns. They were for travellers, merchants, pilgrim, nobles on the move. You got a meal, maybe, a spot to sleep, usually shared, and a stable for your horse, privacy. Ha! You were lucky if you got your own blanket, let alone a separate room. Most sleeping quarters were communal, packed with strangers snoring, groaning, and possibly sleep-talking in Latin. The floors creaked, the beds sagged, and the lice partied like it was 1399. Tavern keepers, often called alewives if female, were known figures in their communities. They brewed the ale, served the food, and kept order with a wooden spoon, or a glare sharp enough to stop a brawl mid-swing. Alewives were even subject to quality inspections. In some towns, if your brew was too weak or too watery, you could be dragged through the streets in a barrel or fined by the ale taster. Yes, ale taster was an official job. And yes, people probably fought over who got to do it. Not all was merry. Of course, fights were common, theft happened, and taverns were often blamed for corrupting the moral fibre of communities. Preachers railed against them. Laws tried to limit their hours, but people kept coming. Because where else could you get a warm seat, hot drink, and listen to a toothless bard scream-sing about dragons? Scholars today debate the role taverns played in shaping social structures. Were they equalising spaces where all classes mingled? Or deeply stratified venues where peasants stuck to the back tables while nobles slummed it in disguise? The evidence says both. Depending on the region and the century, taverns could be melting pots or social minefields. Either way, they were vital. So tonight, as you sip your hot tea, stream your favourite playlist, or hang out in a cafe with clean floors and functioning plumbing, take a moment to imagine the medieval version. Muddy boots, see the steam rising from a pot of cabbage, someone yelling in a dialect you barely understand, a bard in the corner strumming a poorly tuned lute, and a mug of warm, flat ale with bits floating in it. You probably wouldn't stay long, but for a medieval traveller it was a little oasis of light, warmth, and noise in a cold, dark world. You wake up to the smell of bread baking and the faint clang of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere down the lane. Outside your window, if you have one, townspeople are already shuffling through narrow streets, dodging carts, chamber potsler, and an aggressive rooster with boundary issues. You stretch, yawn, and immediately remember, it's market day, which means your little town, usually just a sleepy cluster of timber buildings and gossip, is about to transform into a chaotic, muddy, gloriously overwhelming carnival of commerce. And you, of course, have onions to sell, or maybe turnips, or maybe just yourself as a labourer if the day goes badly. Market days were the lifeblood of medieval towns and villages. Held weekly, sometimes more often in larger cities, they were where people bought goods, sold their wares, caught up on news, showed off their best cloaks, and tried not to get trampled by an ox cart. From sunrise to sundown, stalls lined the streets, voices competed for attention, and the smells, well, they did their best. Picture the combined scent of baked bread, unwashed peasants, smoked fish, manure, cheese that's evolved a personality, and a hint of spiced wine. Then add mud. So much mud. Vendors called out from behind wooden carts or cloth-covered stalls, Fresh herrings are still twitching if you squint. Oats and barley, last sack before the bishop takes his cut. Some had proper licenses, some didn't. Market inspectors roamed with notched measuring sticks and scowls, checking weights and scales. Shortchange a customer and you could be fined, or worse, publicly shamed by being tied to your own stall with a placard reading cheat. But most sellers were honest enough. Farmers brought their best produce. Bakers hauled in carts of bread, rye for the poor, wheat if you were lucky. Butchers, tanners, candle makers and weavers all tried to outshout one another. Children darted between legs, dogs scavenged beneath benches, and somewhere, someone was definitely stealing something. Pickpockets loved market day. So did rats, and suspiciously charming jugglers. Let's take a moment to appreciate the food stalls. Medieval street food wasn't fancy, but it was hearty. Meat pies, stewed peas, roasted chestnuts, fritters, cheap, hot, and sometimes even safe to eat. In cities like London or Paris, you might grab a hot beef and ale pasty or a sweet pastry filled with currants and spices. And if you had a few extra coins, maybe you splurged on mulled wine or a honey cake. Unless, of course, you lost your appetite after watching the fishmonger gut an eel with alarming flair. And here's your fringe fact for the night. In some towns, local governments required that certain foods be sold in fixed locations to prevent chaos. Fish went here, bread went there, meat at the far end, near the tanners, naturally. Because what's better than fresh pork chops next to someone boiling animal hides? The logic was unclear, but the smell certainly wasn't. Markets weren't just for food and goods, they were social engines. News travelled fast in crowded spaces. Who's engaged? Who's pregnant? Who insulted the bailiff's new hat? You'd hear local gossip, foreign rumours, and if you stood near the right storyteller, dramatic tales of dragons, saints, or that one time your cousin wrestled a bear behind the alehouse. Spoiler, he didn't win. Troubadours sang, monks begged for alms, and fortune-tellers offered to read your palm. For a price, of course. And then came the rules. Market law was serious business. Prices could be fixed to prevent inflation. Certain days were reserved for specific goods. Foreign traders had to pay a toll. Selling during church hours? Illegal. Selling outside the official market boundaries? Also illegal. Some towns even banned overly aggressive haggling. If you argued too loudly, you could be removed by the sergeants at mace. Basically, the medieval version of mall cops with sticks and authority complexes. Not that it stopped the arguing. Haggling was an art. You never paid the asking price. That would be madness. You offered half, the seller laughed. You pretended to walk away, and eventually you met somewhere in the middle. The ritual mattered almost as much as the deal. Everyone knew their role. Everyone played along. For poorer folk, the market was also a rare chance to buy or trade essentials. Pins, thread, soap, candles, shoes. You didn't go shopping for fun. You went because you needed something you couldn't make yourself. Maybe new soles for your boots, or a pot to replace the one your cousin tripped over last week during a dance gone wrong. Coin was tight, but barter still worked. Eggs for cloth, firewood for bread, labour for everything else. And let's not forget the performers. Every market had them. Minstrels, jugglers, puppet shows, actors reenacting biblical stories with homemade costumes and slightly unhinged energy. They performed between stalls, passing hats afterward. Some even sold miracle cures, ointments, potions, dried herbs guaranteed to make you more attractive or less dead. You'd buy it. You'd regret it. Then you'd buy it again. Scholars still argue about how regulated these markets were. Some records show strict control, market guilds, tax collectors with eagle eyes. Others describe a more chaotic, borderline anarchic setup where anything went as long as no one got stabbed, and even that was negotiable. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Medieval life wasn't static. It flexed, adapted, and occasionally looked the other way. So tonight, when you scroll through your phone and order takeout or impulse buy socks from a glowing rectangle, think of your medieval counterpart, elbow deep in onions, yelling at a butcher over the price of bacon, laughing at a fire eater, and ducking as someone flings a cabbage at a very aggressive street preacher. Markets weren't perfect. They were loud, filthy, and unpredictable. But they were alive. And in a world with few certainties, that was more than enough. And now, here you are, blanket pulled up to your chin, fan humming softly in the corner, stomach full, teeth brushed, and not a lice in sight. You've survived 25 trips through the muck and madness of the Middle Ages, and you didn't even have to sell onions to do it. From sweating in plate armour to freezing in draughty cottages, from scolds' bridles to chamber pots, you've wandered through the strange, stinky, occasionally poetic rhythm of a world that feels impossibly far away, and yet oddly familiar. Because as much as we chuckle at the toothworms, shudder at the sleeping arrangements, or marvel at the plague doctor's bird cosplay, the truth is medieval people weren't so different. They still worried about their health, fretted over bad breath, argued with neighbours, and tried desperately to stay warm in the winter. They fell in love. They got into petty arguments. They danced when no one was looking, hopefully. They did the best they could with the knowledge they had, which, let's face it, sometimes involved vinegar-soaked sponges and goat-fat poultices. And sure, maybe they didn't have running water or central heating or antibacterial soap, but they had hot bread. They had laughter. They had community and stories and a sense that even in the mud and mess, life was worth celebrating, even if it smelled like boiled cabbage most of the time. So as you drift off tonight, give a little mental nod to those unsung heroes of the itchy, smoky, slightly fermented past. The turnip seller with a dream, the knight with chafing armour, and absolutely no deodorant, the alewife with a spoon in one hand and justice in the other. They walked so you could binge documentaries and complain about slow Wi-Fi. And now, finally, your journey is complete. You've earned this sleep. Deep, warm, and beautifully modern. May your dreams be lice-free, your bedsheets crisp, and your chamber pots non-existent. End of script. Sweet dreams.